The world around them has been transformed countless times, yet these ancient places continue to stand almost outside of time. Long before modern machines reshaped landscapes or technology allowed us to see the Earth from above, forgotten civilizations were already building monuments meant to endure far beyond their own lifetimes. Their methods faded, their voices disappeared, and much of the knowledge behind their creations vanished with them. What remains are enormous stones, buried chambers, abandoned pathways, and structures whose details still raise questions thousands of years later. Each discovery brings another fragment of the past into view, but the complete picture remains just beyond our reach. These monuments have survived long enough to become more than ruins. They have become mysteries passed from one generation to the next. Today, we follow the traces they left behind into an ancient world that time never completely erased. Blondos, perched on a limestone plateau above deep canyons in western Turkey, appears at first glance to be another forgotten Greco-Roman city, yet almost everything that made it function remains hidden beneath the ground. Modern archaeological investigations have revealed only fragments of its streets and monuments, leaving one of Anatolia's most intriguing urban landscapes largely unexplored despite decades of research. The ancient city first attracted scholarly attention during 19th century surveys of the region, but systematic archaeological excavations did not begin until the 21st century. As trenches expanded across the plateau, archaeologists uncovered sections of paved streets, monumental gateways, Roman baths, temples, houses decorated with frescoes, water systems, and a theatre overlooking the surrounding valleys. Every excavation season seemed to expose another well-preserved structure, yet each discovery also emphasized how little of the settlement had actually been investigated. Blondos occupies roughly 20 to 25 hectares, but only a small percentage has been excavated in detail. Geophysical surveys, aerial photography, and topographic mapping indicate that extensive architectural remains continue beneath the surface, suggesting that the visible ruins represent only a fraction of the original city. That incomplete picture has transformed Blondos into one of the most frustrating archaeological puzzles in Western Anatolia, because the city appears far more prosperous than historians can currently explain. Its monumental architecture rivals that of significantly larger regional centers. Roman baths required sophisticated hydraulic engineering and continuous water supplies. The theatre demanded substantial financial investment and skilled labor. Public squares, colonnaded streets, carefully constructed drainage systems, and spacious residences decorated with painted plaster all point toward a wealthy urban community capable of maintaining expensive civic infrastructure over several centuries. Yet the economic foundation that supported such prosperity remains remarkably elusive. Blondos possessed none of the obvious advantages normally associated with affluent Roman cities. It was not a major seaport connected to Mediterranean commerce. No large navigable river passed beneath its cliffs. No extensive mineral deposits have been securely identified nearby, and it does not appear to have occupied one of the principal long-distance trade corridors crossing Anatolia. By conventional economic models, the city should never have accumulated enough wealth to finance the urban landscape that excavation continues to reveal. This contradiction becomes even more striking as additional structures emerge from beneath the soil. Newly uncovered elite residences display architectural refinement far beyond what might be expected for a relatively isolated inland settlement. Mosaic floors, painted walls, carefully planned courtyards, and elaborate domestic layouts indicate families with considerable resources, yet inscriptions identifying powerful merchant dynasties, wealthy benefactors, or large commercial institutions remain surprisingly scarce. Coin finds demonstrate that Blandos participated in the monetary economy of the Hellenistic and Roman worlds, but coins alone cannot explain the sustained concentration of wealth represented by the city's architecture. Without excavating the administrative quarter, market district, workshops, warehouses, or any potential commercial complexes still buried below ground, archaeologists cannot determine whether Blandos prospered through regional trade, agricultural taxation, specialized industries, imperial patronage, or an economic system that has left almost no surviving written record. The surrounding landscape only deepens the mystery. Blandos occupies a naturally fortified plateau, enclosed on three sides by steep canyons exceeding 100 meters in depth. From a military perspective, the location is exceptionally defensible, but from an economic perspective, it appears inconvenient. Transporting building stone, timber, food supplies, construction materials, and everyday goods onto such an isolated plateau would have required continuous logistical effort. Nevertheless, generations of inhabitants invested enormous resources into expanding the city rather than relocating to more accessible terrain. Archaeologists still debate whether strategic security outweighed commercial disadvantages, or whether an entirely different economic network, now invisible in the archaeological record, once connected Blandos with surrounding settlements more efficiently than modern geography suggests. The unexplored residential districts may eventually answer many of these questions, but at present, they remain almost entirely concealed beneath accumulated soil. Remote sensing has identified numerous buried anomalies consistent with streets, enclosed courtyards, building foundations, and large architectural complexes extending across much of the plateau. Because excavation has exposed only isolated sectors, researchers still cannot reconstruct the complete street grid, identify the true civic center, or determine how different neighborhoods interacted within the urban plan. Every newly opened trench has altered previous interpretations, demonstrating that the city's overall organization remains largely hypothetical. It is entirely possible that administrative buildings, commercial markets, industrial installations, or monumental sanctuaries capable of explaining Blando's prosperity still lie untouched only a few meters beneath the surface. Even the spectacular funerary landscape surrounding the city raises questions that remain unanswered. Hundreds of rock-cut tombs carved directly into the limestone cliffs encircle the plateau, forming one of the largest necropolis complexes in the region. More than 400 tomb chambers have been documented, yet only a limited number have undergone detailed archaeological excavation. Many remain sealed, partially collapsed, or inaccessible because of unstable cliff faces. Their architectural diversity suggests differences in wealth, family status, or chronology, but the full social structure represented by the necropolis cannot be reconstructed, while the overwhelming majority of tombs remain unexamined. Some chambers extend far into the rock beyond their visible entrances, creating the possibility that additional burial galleries or interconnected spaces remain hidden behind collapsed passages. Without systematic excavation, the true scale of this cemetery remains unknown. Another unresolved problem concerns the sequence of occupation itself. Blandos originated during the Hellenistic period, following the campaigns of Alexander the Great, before continuing to flourish under Roman and later Byzantine administration. Each successive community reused, modified, or rebuilt earlier structures, producing complex archaeological layers that are difficult to separate without large-scale excavation. Walls belonging to different centuries often overlap. Public buildings were repeatedly remodeled, and domestic architecture evolved as political authority changed. Because only isolated sectors have been investigated, archaeologists still cannot reconstruct the city's earliest urban layout or determine how dramatically later generations transformed the original settlement. The buried portions of Blondos may preserve precisely the missing evidence needed to understand those transitions. Recent discoveries continue to reinforce the impression that the city has revealed only its outermost layer. Excavations during the past decade have uncovered additional frescoed residences, hydraulic installations, sculptural fragments, inscriptions, coins, ceramic assemblages, and architectural elements whose quality exceeds expectations for a settlement of this apparent size. Almost every newly investigated area has produced important remains rather than empty ground, implying that the archaeological potential beneath the plateau remains extraordinarily high. Instead of approaching a complete understanding of Blondos, each excavation season seems to expand the number of unanswered questions. The buried city consistently proves larger, richer, and more sophisticated than scholars anticipated, while the mechanisms that created such prosperity remain hidden beyond the limits of present excavation. Bishapur Lower City, Fars Province, southwestern Iran, first recognized in the 19th century and investigated systematically by Roman Gershmen between the 1930s and 1970s, the site revealed one of the greatest capitals of the Sasanian Empire, yet almost everything uncovered belonged to the royal quarter, while the vast lower city remained buried beneath farmland, alluvial deposits, and centuries of accumulated soil. Covering nearly 200 hectares and founded by King Shapur I, shortly after his victory over the Roman Emperor Valerian around 260 CE, Bishapur appears on maps as a complete planned city, but archaeology has exposed only a small fraction of what once stood there. The discoveries made inside the excavated core immediately raised a contradiction that still defines Bishapur. Archaeologists uncovered an elaborate palace decorated with some of the finest Roman-style mosaics ever found in Iran, the monumental Temple of Anahita, built with precisely cut stone blocks, broad avenues arranged on an organized street grid, and sophisticated hydraulic channels designed to manage water from the nearby Shapur River. These monuments demonstrate an extraordinary level of urban planning, yet they all belong to the ceremonial center, the city where ordinary people actually lived, traded, manufactured goods, and governed daily life has remained almost untouched, leaving researchers with an impressive royal facade, but very little understanding of the society that sustained it. Remote sensing, aerial photography, and geophysical surveys suggest that the buried city extends far beyond the excavated monuments. Magnetic anomalies reveal long linear structures, rectangular building foundations, and continuous street patterns hidden beneath the surface. Instead of isolated ruins, the evidence points toward entire urban districts still preserved underground. In several areas, these anomalies continue for hundreds of meters before disappearing beneath modern agricultural fields, indicating that the visible ruins represent only a fraction of the original settlement. Despite decades of research, very few of these subsurface features have been opened, meaning the archaeological map of Bishapur remains largely theoretical rather than confirmed by excavation. This creates one of the greatest unanswered questions surrounding the city. How large was its real population? Based on the overall urban footprint, scholars have estimated that Bishapur may once have supported somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest Sasanian foundations of its time. Yet these estimates rely almost entirely on comparisons with other ancient cities, because almost no residential neighborhoods have been excavated. There are no complete housing blocks, no fully exposed marketplaces, no workshops arranged in their original urban context, and no evidence allowing archaeologists to calculate population density with confidence. For a city that once served as a royal capital, its civilian population remains almost invisible. The city's remarkable street plan deepens the mystery. Unlike many ancient settlements that expanded gradually over centuries, Bishapur was designed from the beginning according to an organized geometric layout influenced by both Persian and Roman engineering traditions. Excavated avenues intersect at nearly right angles, suggesting an extensive orthogonal plan stretching into the unexcavated lower city. Yet those carefully paved streets simply vanish beneath accumulated sediments. No one knows where they ultimately led, whether they connected to massive public squares, administrative compounds, commercial districts, or neighborhoods still completely hidden below ground. It is as though archaeologists have uncovered the entrance to an enormous city, while the remaining chapters of its history remain sealed beneath the earth. Water management presents another puzzle that cannot yet be solved. The royal sector demonstrates impressive hydraulic engineering, including stone-lined canals, drainage systems, and carefully controlled water circulation feeding ceremonial architecture. Such infrastructure could not have served only the palace. A settlement covering 200 hectares would have required an extensive network distributing fresh water, removing wastewater, and protecting streets from seasonal flooding caused by the Shapur River. Yet because the lower city has barely been investigated, the full hydraulic system has never been reconstructed. Whether Bishapur possessed underground conduits comparable to later Persian qanats, large public reservoirs, or neighborhood drainage networks remains unknown, despite the city's obvious dependence on sophisticated water control. An equally significant absence involves industry. Every capital of comparable scale required facilities for ceramic production, metalworking, glass manufacture, textile processing, food storage, and commercial distribution. Excavations have produced scattered artifacts proving such activities existed, including pottery, metal objects, coins, and imported materials. But the industrial quarters themselves remain missing. Their absence is unlikely to reflect reality. Instead, many archaeologists suspect that the workshops, warehouses, and production centers still lie beneath the unexplored lower city, preserving evidence capable of revealing how the Sasanian economy functioned at an urban scale. Historical sources introduce another layer of uncertainty. Following his capture of the Roman Emperor Valerian in 260 CE, Shapur I reportedly relocated thousands of Roman prisoners into Persia. Ancient writers describe these captives as engineers, craftsmen, and skilled builders who contributed to major construction projects. Bishapur's architecture certainly reflects unusual Roman influence, particularly in its mosaics, masonry techniques, and aspects of urban planning. Yet without excavating the civilian districts, no one knows how deeply Roman traditions shaped everyday life beyond the palace walls. Were Roman artisans integrated into mixed neighborhoods alongside Persian residents, or did they occupy distinct quarters within the city? The answer may still lie beneath fields that have never been systematically explored. Geophysical investigations continue to hint at remarkable discoveries waiting below the surface. Beneath apparently empty ground, instruments repeatedly detect massive rectangular foundations, thick walls, enclosed compounds, and architectural alignments inconsistent with natural geology. Some anomalies are large enough to represent administrative complexes or public buildings, comparable in size to structures already excavated, while others resemble densely packed residential blocks. Because only a handful have been tested through excavation, their true identity remains entirely speculative. Every survey seems to reveal another buried district, but the overwhelming majority of these discoveries exist only as invisible patterns recorded by scientific instruments. Even the city's decline remains uncertain. Bishapur gradually lost its political importance after the fall of the Sasanian Empire during the 7th century, but the reasons behind its abandonment remain debated. Some researchers emphasize shifting trade routes. Others point toward political transformation following the Islamic conquest, while geological studies suggest that earthquakes or changes in the course of the Shapur River may also have played significant roles. Normally, archaeologists would resolve such questions by examining widespread destruction layers, rebuilding phases, abandoned neighborhoods, and domestic refuse across the urban landscape. Because the lower city has never been properly excavated, the physical evidence necessary to distinguish between these competing explanations is still largely inaccessible. Istakhr, Fars Province, Iran. Only a few kilometers north of Persepolis stands the forgotten city that inherited the heart of ancient Persia, yet most of it still lies untouched beneath layers of earth. Although archaeologists recognized its importance more than a century ago through surveys and limited excavations led by Ernst Herzfeld in the early 20th century, only scattered portions of the ancient settlement have ever been investigated, leaving one of the greatest capitals of Iranian history largely hidden beneath farmland and accumulated sediment. The irony surrounding Istakhr begins with its remarkable place in history. When Alexander the Great captured and burned Persepolis around 330 BCE, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire entered irreversible decline. Instead of disappearing with it, political and religious life gradually shifted to nearby Istakhr. By the Parthian period, and especially under the Sasanian Empire between the 3rd and 7th centuries CE, the city had become one of the most influential centers in Persia. Royal inscriptions, Islamic chronicles, and later historical traditions consistently describe Istakhr as a city associated with kingship, administration, and Zoroastrian worship. Despite that reputation, the archaeological record remains astonishingly incomplete. The visible ruins represent only isolated fragments of what geophysical surveys and surface archaeology suggest was once an extensive urban landscape stretching across many dozens of hectares, while much of the ancient city still rests beneath deposits that have never been systematically explored. Among all the unanswered questions surrounding Istakhr, none is more compelling than the search for its legendary sacred fire. Historical texts repeatedly associate the city with one of the most important religious sanctuaries of ancient Iran, a place linked either to the Temple of Anahid, the Iranian goddess Anahita, or to one of the great royal fire temples dedicated to Atar, the sacred fire of Zoroastrianism. During the Sasanian period, fire temples were not merely religious buildings. They represented political legitimacy, royal authority, and the spiritual identity of the empire itself. Several medieval Persian and Arabic writers described Istakhr as the guardian of an eternal sacred flame maintained by priests for generations. If those accounts are accurate, the sanctuary would have ranked among the holiest places in the empire. Yet after more than 100 years of archaeological investigation, nobody can identify with certainty where that sanctuary actually stood. Several monumental foundations uncovered around the ancient mound have at different times been proposed as candidates. Some possess thick stone walls compatible with large ceremonial buildings, while others occupy elevated positions overlooking the surrounding plain. None, however, has produced the unmistakable architectural features expected from a major Sasanian fire temple. Archaeologists have not identified an intact fire altar, a complete ritual chamber, or inscriptions directly naming the sanctuary. The absence of definitive evidence has created competing interpretations. One group argues that the temple was dismantled after the Islamic conquest, its stones reused in later construction. Another believes the true sanctuary has never been excavated because the most promising sectors remain buried beneath later deposits. Ground observations indicate extensive subsurface anomalies beyond the excavated zones, suggesting that substantial masonry structures still survive underground. Until those areas are investigated, one of the spiritual centers of ancient Persia remains effectively lost, despite historians having described it for more than 1,000 years. That uncertainty extends far beyond the temple itself, because almost every major building expected in a city of this importance appears to be missing. Contemporary sources portray Istakhr as a royal center visited by Sasanian rulers, implying the existence of administrative complexes, reception halls, treasuries, archives, and elite residences. Yet none has been conclusively identified. Magnetic surveys and surface mapping reveal large rectangular foundations concealed beneath the soil, some measuring tens of meters across, but excavation has reached only a fraction of these anomalies. Without exposing them, archaeologists cannot determine whether they belong to palaces, government buildings, military headquarters, or monumental religious structures. The city therefore survives as an outline visible through instruments rather than through excavation, with buried architecture continuing to shape maps more clearly than historical interpretation. The mystery grows even deeper because Istakhr may preserve more than one forgotten city stacked beneath another. Its location immediately beside Persepolis has long encouraged scholars to suspect that occupation began before the rise of the Sasanian Empire. Some researchers propose that an Achaemenid settlement serving Persepolis already existed here during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, later becoming the nucleus from which the post-Alexander city expanded. If this hypothesis is correct, several centuries of rebuilding would have buried earlier neighborhoods beneath later construction. Excavating one period without destroying another becomes extraordinarily difficult, explaining why so much remains untouched. Every trench opened into the ground could pass through successive layers representing Achaemenid, Hellenistic, Parthian, Sasanian, and early Islamic occupation, each preserving a different chapter of Persian history. Material recovered from limited excavations hints at the complexity still concealed below. Pottery spans multiple historical periods. Architectural fragments display both Achaemenid and Sasanian traditions. Coins minted under successive dynasties appear in remarkable quantities, demonstrating that commercial and administrative activity continued for centuries. Yet these discoveries raise as many questions as they answer. Thousands of coins indicate an economically vibrant city, but the mint itself has never been securely located. Administrative records almost certainly existed, yet nothing comparable to the famous Persepolis fortification tablets has emerged from Istakhr. Whether those archives were destroyed, removed, or still lie hidden beneath unexplored districts remains completely unknown. Equally enigmatic is the city's defensive system. Traces of fortification walls remain visible across portions of the site, but their original dimensions, construction phases, and complete layout have never been reconstructed. Remote sensing suggests that buried wall segments continue beneath agricultural land beyond the excavated perimeter. Some anomalies may represent towers or gateways, while others could indicate defensive ditches or secondary enclosures protecting different quarters of the city. Without broader excavation, historians cannot determine how Istakhr defended one of the most politically significant regions of the Sasanian Empire, or how those defenses evolved during repeated conflicts with Roman and later Arab forces. The final years of the city are themselves surprisingly obscure. Historical accounts describe fierce fighting during the Arab conquest of Persia in the 7th century CE, with Istakhr resisting more than once before finally falling around 650 to 653 CE. Chronicles mention destruction and heavy casualties, yet archaeology has failed to reveal a single, continuous destruction layer across the site. Instead of evidence for one catastrophic event, the buried remains suggest a more complicated process of gradual decline, abandonment, rebuilding, and reuse. Whether the city collapsed suddenly after military defeat or slowly lost its population over generations remains unresolved because so much of the archaeological evidence is still inaccessible beneath unexcavated ground. Huqoq, Lower Galilee, Israel. Beneath the hills overlooking the Sea of Galilee lies an ancient settlement whose most astonishing discoveries emerged only after a small portion of its ruins was finally uncovered, revealing that one of Judaism's most extraordinary artistic monuments had remained hidden for nearly 15 centuries, while much of the city itself still rests beneath the earth. The site had long been identified with the biblical village of Huqoq through historical texts, ancient pilgrim accounts, and scattered architectural remains, yet systematic archaeological work did not begin until the early 21st century. When excavations started in 2011 under the direction of Jody Magnus and an international research team, expectations were relatively modest. Previous surveys suggested the presence of a late Roman or Byzantine synagogue, but few anticipated discoveries that would transform scholarly understanding of Jewish art during late antiquity. Instead of exposing an ordinary religious building, archaeologists encountered one remarkable mosaic after another, each season revealing scenes that seemed increasingly unlike anything previously known. Yet despite more than a decade of work, only a fraction of the ancient settlement has been investigated, leaving most of Huqoq buried beneath accumulated soil, collapsed masonry, cultivated fields, and later occupation layers. The synagogue itself was constructed during the late 4th or early 5th century, when Galilee formed part of the Eastern Roman Empire. Its builders possessed no iron-based industrial machinery capable of moving enormous architectural blocks with modern precision. Like generations before them, they relied upon limestone quarried from the surrounding hills, bronze and iron hand tools of the period, wooden cranes, ropes, rollers, chisels, levers, and immense coordinated human labor. Thousands of carefully shaped limestone blocks formed walls that survived repeated earthquakes, while floors were paved with mosaics assembled from hundreds of thousands, and likely more than 1 million, tiny tesserae cut individually from colored limestone, marble, basalt, terracotta, and imported glass. Every image demanded astonishing accuracy, because a single misplaced tessera could distort an entire figure. The technical achievement alone demonstrates a level of craftsmanship rarely associated with rural Jewish communities of late antiquity. Yet the architecture soon became overshadowed by something far stranger. Nearly every excavation season produced another mosaic panel unlike those found in any previously excavated synagogue. For decades, scholars believed Jewish synagogues from this period generally favored geometric decoration, symbolic motifs, zodiac wheels, menorahs, or familiar biblical episodes arranged in conventional ways. Huqoq shattered that assumption. Instead, its floors presented vivid narratives filled with movement, emotion, and artistic complexity that appeared almost experimental. Samson carrying away the gates of Gaza stretched across one section with extraordinary realism. Nearby, another composition depicted Samson releasing flaming foxes among enemy fields. Noah's Ark appeared crowded with carefully rendered animals, each species receiving unusual artistic attention. Jonah emerged from the great fish in a scene unlike parallel examples elsewhere. The Tower of Babel rose through carefully arranged stone cubes whose perspective demonstrated remarkable planning by mosaic artists working entirely with hand-cut tesserae. Then came the images that transformed fascination into genuine archaeological mystery. One mosaic portrayed heavily armed soldiers confronting richly dressed figures beside war elephants. Another displayed an elaborate ceremonial meeting between rulers whose identities remained fiercely debated. Some researchers argue these scenes represent Alexander the Great meeting the Jewish high priest in Jerusalem, an event preserved in later historical traditions, but absent from the Hebrew Bible. Others believe the composition illustrates victories of the Maccabees, while another group proposes an entirely different historical episode or even a symbolic theological narrative rather than literal history. None of these interpretations has achieved scholarly consensus because the inscriptions necessary to identify the figures are missing. Archaeologists therefore possess one of the finest surviving narrative mosaics from late antiquity, while remaining unable to explain with certainty what story it actually tells. Every newly uncovered fragment has expanded possibilities instead of narrowing them, making Hukok one of the rare archaeological sites where additional evidence continually creates new questions rather than resolving old ones. The mystery deepens because these extraordinary images appeared inside a village that, according to traditional historical models, should never have possessed such immense wealth. Galilee during the 4th and 5th centuries has often been portrayed as economically weakened compared with earlier Roman prosperity, yet Hukok contradicts that expectation. Producing mosaics of this quality required highly trained craftsmen, imported materials, specialized workshops, and patrons capable of financing years of construction. Individual tesserae were trimmed into precise geometric forms before being arranged into gradients that created shadows, expressions, muscles, flowing garments, architectural perspective, and natural landscapes. The artistic sophistication rivals celebrated mosaics from major Roman cities rather than isolated rural settlements. If Hukok truly represented only a modest agricultural village, where did the money originate? Who commissioned such ambitious decoration? And why has no inscription identifying these benefactors ever been discovered? Geophysical surveys conducted beyond the synagogue indicate that the visible monument occupies only a small portion of a much larger settlement. Ground-penetrating radar and surface investigations suggest buried walls, domestic structures, streets, courtyards, storage facilities, and additional public buildings extending beneath unexcavated terrain. Excavating these areas would require decades of work, enormous financial investment, and difficult decisions regarding preservation, because removing later deposits inevitably destroys evidence from subsequent historical periods. Consequently, archaeologists must leave much of the ancient city untouched, preserving its secrets while simultaneously preventing immediate answers. It remains entirely possible that archives, inscriptions, workshops, elite residences, or additional monumental buildings capable of explaining the synagogue's remarkable prosperity still lie concealed only a short distance from the trenches already opened. Even within the synagogue itself, the surprises appear far from exhausted. Successive excavation seasons repeatedly exposed previously unknown mosaic panels beneath collapsed roofing material and accumulated sediment, demonstrating that substantial portions of the decorative floor remained hidden despite years of research. Every newly revealed section altered scholarly interpretations of the building's iconographic program. Rather than following a predictable decorative sequence, the mosaics combine biblical narratives, historical traditions, symbolic imagery, and scenes whose meanings remain elusive. This complexity raises another unresolved question. Were these images intended primarily as religious instruction, expressions of communal identity, political statements, visual theology, or coded messages understandable only to local worshippers? Without written explanations, every interpretation remains provisional. The settlement also preserves evidence from multiple chronological layers, extending beyond the synagogue itself. Beneath Byzantine occupation lie Roman remains, with indications that earlier Hellenistic and perhaps Hasmonean activity may also survive below. Each generation constructed directly upon the ruins of its predecessors, sealing older architecture beneath newer foundations. Reaching the deepest phases often requires dismantling later structures, an irreversible process that archaeologists approach with extreme caution. As a result, some of the oldest chapters in Huqoq's history remain physically inaccessible, despite lying only a few meters beneath the surface. Toliajori, Fars Province, Iran. Just a few kilometers from Persepolis stands a buried monument that should not exist. Beneath a low mound of earth lies a gateway built in unmistakable Babylonian style, yet it rises from the heart of ancient Persia, where no one expected such a structure. First recognized during archaeological surveys of the Persepolis Plain and systematically investigated by the joint Iranian-Italian archaeological mission beginning in 2011, the site quickly overturned decades of assumptions. Instead of revealing another ordinary Achaemenid building, excavators uncovered fragments of glazed bricks, massive mud brick walls, and mythical creatures identical to those once decorating Babylon's legendary Ishtar Gate. Yet, after more than a decade of work, only a small portion of the monument has been exposed, while the landscape surrounding it remains largely untouched beneath layers of soil, leaving one extraordinary question unanswered. Why would the founders of the Persian Empire construct what appears to be a Babylonian ceremonial gateway in their own royal homeland? The first clues emerged as archaeologists removed shallow deposits covering an enormous rectangular building measuring roughly 40 by 30 meters, its walls reaching nearly 10 meters in thickness in some sections, and constructed from millions of sun-dried mud bricks strengthened with fired brick facings. Such dimensions immediately suggested that this had never been an ordinary residence or defensive tower. Even more surprising was the discovery of hundreds, then thousands, of brightly colored glazed brick fragments scattered throughout the collapsed debris. Laboratory analysis identified blue, white, yellow, black, and turquoise glazes manufactured using techniques remarkably similar to Neo-Babylonian production methods dating to the 6th century BCE. As additional fragments were assembled, images gradually appeared: powerful bulls, long-necked dragons known as mushusu, rosettes, geometric borders, and decorative patterns, so closely matching Babylon's Ishtar Gate that specialists could reconstruct large portions of the original facade with unexpected confidence. The resemblance was not superficial. The proportions, brick dimensions, iconography, and glazing technology all pointed toward direct knowledge of Babylonian monumental architecture rather than simple artistic inspiration. That discovery immediately created a historical paradox. Babylon lay nearly 1,000 kilometers from Persepolis, separated by deserts, mountains, and political traditions that had developed independently for centuries. Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, incorporating the wealthy metropolis into the expanding Achaemenid Empire. Historians have long understood that Persian rulers admired Babylonian administration, engineering, and craftsmanship, but no surviving royal inscription ever mentions transporting an entire ceremonial gateway design into the Persian heartland. If Toliajori truly copied the Ishtar Gate, someone intentionally recreated one of the most recognizable monuments in the ancient Near East. Yet no contemporary document explains who ordered it, why it was built, or what message it was intended to convey. Was it a political statement celebrating the conquest of Babylon, an attempt to unite different cultures within a growing empire, or the work of Babylonian craftsmen employed directly by the Persian court. Without larger excavations, every explanation remains speculative. Scientific dating adds another layer of mystery. Ceramic typology, brick technology, architectural comparisons, and radiocarbon evidence consistently place the construction of Toli Ajori between approximately 540 and 520 BCE, placing it among the earliest monumental Achaemenid buildings ever identified on the Persepolis Plain. That chronology is significant because the great palaces of Persepolis, usually associated with Darius the Great, were begun only afterward. If the dates are correct, Tol Ajori may belong to a transitional phase before Persepolis evolved into the ceremonial capital known today. Instead of representing an isolated monument, it could preserve evidence of an earlier royal landscape that has almost completely disappeared beneath the surrounding plain. Yet because only a fraction of the site has been uncovered, archaeologists cannot determine whether the gateway once stood alone or formed the entrance to a much larger complex extending beneath unexcavated ground. Geophysical surveys have made that uncertainty even more intriguing. Magnetometry and other non-invasive investigations detected additional buried anomalies extending beyond the excavated architecture, suggesting walls, foundations, and possible structures still concealed beneath agricultural soil. These features have never been completely explored, largely because excavation over such a wide area would require enormous financial resources and would permanently disturb deposits that current conservation policies prefer to leave untouched until better technologies become available. Consequently, the visible gateway may represent only the smallest surviving portion of a far larger ceremonial district. If that interpretation proves correct, the most important discoveries at Toli Ajori may still lie completely hidden beneath the fields surrounding the present excavation trenches. Meanwhile, every excavation season has produced thousands of additional glazed brick fragments, creating one of the largest collections of Achaemenid decorative architectural material ever recovered from a single early imperial site. Many fragments preserve only portions of scales, horns, hooves, tails, or floral ornaments, forcing specialists to reconstruct the original appearance, much like assembling an immense three-dimensional puzzle with countless missing pieces. Digital modeling has helped identify repeated decorative sequences, but significant portions of the facade remain impossible to restore because corresponding fragments have never been found. It is entirely possible that the missing sections still remain buried nearby, waiting beneath areas that have never been opened. A single future excavation could reveal inscriptions, complete mythological figures, or decorative programs capable of identifying the ruler responsible for the monument, transforming current hypotheses into historical certainty almost overnight. Equally puzzling is the remarkable silence of written history. Persepolis has yielded tens of thousands of administrative clay tablets, documenting workers, rations, construction projects, and royal administration with extraordinary precision. Babylon likewise produced enormous archives describing political, religious, and economic life in exceptional detail. Yet Toli Ajori has produced no comparable archive explaining its purpose. No foundation inscription has been recovered, no dedicatory text identifies its builder, no surviving tablet records ceremonies held there, or explains why such an unmistakably Babylonian monument appeared in Persia. For a structure requiring immense labor, specialized artisans, imported technologies, and careful planning, its complete disappearance from written history is astonishing. The monument seems to have existed almost entirely outside the surviving historical record. Evidence also indicates that the gateway enjoyed a surprisingly short life. Architectural analysis suggests that parts of the structure were deliberately dismantled rather than simply collapsing through natural decay. Valuable glazed bricks appear to have been removed systematically, while other construction materials were probably recycled elsewhere. Whether this dismantling resulted from changing political priorities, the rapid development of Persepolis nearby, or an intentional effort to erase an earlier ceremonial center remains unknown. The absence of widespread destruction layers argues against catastrophic warfare, yet the archaeological evidence is still too limited to determine exactly when or why the monument ceased functioning. Every unanswered question ultimately leads back to the same obstacle. Too little of the surrounding landscape has been excavated to reconstruct the broader sequence of events. Located on the Vivari Channel in southern Albania, Butrint conceals far more beneath its wetlands than archaeologists have ever uncovered. First identified through visible classical and Roman ruins, and investigated systematically from the early 20th century onward, the site quickly proved to be far larger than the monuments rising above the surface suggested. Excavations revealed theatres, baths, basilicas, temples, and fortifications, spanning more than 2,000 years of occupation. Yet they also exposed a greater mystery. Almost every trench reached groundwater, deep layers of alluvial sediment, or protected wetlands before the complete urban plan could be traced, leaving much of the lower city buried beneath mud deposited by the Vivari Channel and the surrounding lagoon. Today, Butrint covers nearly 30 hectares within its defensive walls, while geophysical surveys indicate that substantial architectural remains continue beyond the excavated areas, making it one of the Mediterranean's best preserved, yet least completely explored ancient cities. What makes the lower city particularly enigmatic is not the quantity of monuments already uncovered, but the overwhelming evidence that the visible remains represent only a fraction of the original settlement. The city occupied an exceptionally dynamic landscape where rivers, marshes, coastal currents, and fluctuating sea levels continuously reshaped the terrain over centuries. Geological studies demonstrate that repeated sedimentation gradually buried entire neighborhoods beneath several meters of fine silts, while seasonal flooding elevated the groundwater table to a level that severely restricts conventional archaeological excavation. As a result, many excavation campaigns were forced to stop long before reaching the earliest occupation layers, leaving entire districts mapped only through non-invasive techniques rather than direct excavation. Ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, and magnetometry have repeatedly detected rectilinear anomalies extending beneath modern vegetation and agricultural fields, suggesting buried streets, substantial masonry buildings, and organized urban blocks whose exact function remains unknown because almost none of them have been physically excavated. These discoveries become even more significant when considered alongside the city's historical importance as a major maritime center controlling access between the Ionian Sea and the inland waterways of Epirus. Ancient authors described Butrint as an active harbor connected to regional trade throughout the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Yet the archaeological evidence for the port itself remains surprisingly elusive. Despite decades of investigation, no consensus exists regarding the precise location, size, or engineering of the principal harbor installations that sustained the city's economy. This absence has become one of the greatest unresolved questions surrounding Butrint. Some researchers argue that the principal quays now lie deeply buried beneath centuries of river-borne sediment deposited along the Vivari Channel, while others suggest that tectonic activity, coastal subsidence, and gradual shoreline migration shifted the ancient waterfront far beyond the modern shoreline. Geoarchaeological cores recovered from the surrounding wetlands reveal dramatic environmental changes throughout the late Holocene, confirming that the coastline visible today differs substantially from the landscape experienced by ancient inhabitants. If these reconstructions are correct, warehouses, docking platforms, ship repair facilities, customs buildings, and entire commercial quarters may still survive beneath thick alluvial deposits where excavation is currently impractical. The mystery grows because Butrin's prosperity depended on maritime commerce that is difficult to explain without a harbour of considerable capacity. Imported amphorae recovered from excavated contexts demonstrate commercial links extending across the Adriatic, the Aegean, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Marble, fine tableware, olive oil, wine, fish products, and luxury goods all reached the city through maritime exchange. Yet the infrastructure capable of handling this volume of trade has never been conclusively identified. Excavated waterfront fragments appear too limited to represent the principal port, while underwater investigations have identified isolated architectural blocks and submerged features without revealing a complete harbour layout. Even sophisticated remote sensing has produced only partial evidence, because thick sediment masks the geometry of buried structures and underwater visibility remains highly variable. Consequently, one of the economic foundations of Butrin's success remains archaeologically invisible, despite the abundance of historical indicators proving that the port must once have existed. The unresolved harbour also influences nearly every other interpretation of the lower city, because the organization of streets, markets, warehouses, and residential districts would almost certainly have revolved around maritime activity. Yet many excavated roads terminate abruptly beneath unexcavated deposits, preventing archaeologists from determining how the urban grid connected with the waterfront. Several broad paved streets appear to descend toward areas now occupied by marshland, hinting that they once linked directly to docks or commercial plazas that no longer survive above ground. Geophysical surveys continue to detect linear anomalies aligned with these streets beneath adjacent fields, raising the possibility that significant portions of the commercial quarter remain completely intact beneath accumulated sediment. Without exposing these sectors, it remains impossible to reconstruct the circulation of goods through the city, or to understand how merchants, ships, and storage facilities interacted within the urban landscape. This uncertainty extends beyond the harbour into the city's overall development, because Butrint evolved through successive Greek, Hellenistic, Roman, Byzantine, and Venetian occupations. Each civilization constructed new buildings upon earlier foundations, creating a deeply stratified archaeological sequence that can exceed several meters in thickness. Excavated trenches frequently reveal Roman walls erected over Hellenistic structures, Byzantine churches incorporating Roman masonry, and medieval fortifications reusing blocks taken from much older monuments. While these superimposed layers provide remarkable evidence for long-term continuity, they also complicate excavation enormously, because exposing one period often requires disturbing another, equally valuable phase. Consequently, archaeologists have intentionally left extensive areas untouched, preserving them for future generations equipped with less destructive technologies capable of extracting information while minimizing irreversible damage. Recent advances in archaeological science have therefore shifted attention toward non-invasive exploration rather than large-scale excavation. High-resolution magnetometry, electrical resistivity imaging, LiDAR-derived terrain models, sediment coring, and three-dimensional geophysical mapping continue to reveal hidden architectural patterns beneath the lower city without removing a single layer of soil. These techniques consistently indicate that the buried urban landscape extends well beyond the excavated monuments, Yet they also emphasize how little can be confidently interpreted without direct investigation. Rectangular anomalies could represent houses, warehouses, administrative buildings, workshops, or entirely different structures whose identity remains unknowable until excavation becomes feasible. Every new survey, therefore, expands both archaeological knowledge and archaeological uncertainty simultaneously. Philippi Lower City, northeastern Greece. Beneath one of the most famous archaeological cities in Macedonia lies a second city that has never been fully uncovered. First recognized through systematic excavations that began in the early 20th century, after centuries of scattered observations around the ancient ruins, Philippi gradually revealed its theatre, forum, basilicas, and principal public monuments. Yet every excavation exposed an unexpected reality. The monumental center represented only a fraction of the ancient settlement, while large sections of the lower city remained buried beneath modern farmland and deep alluvial deposits. More than a century later, archaeologists have mapped many hidden structures using aerial photography, geophysical surveys, and ground-penetrating radar, but excavation itself has reached only limited portions of these underground districts. As a result, Philippi has become one of the clearest examples of an ancient city whose true extent is still largely invisible despite decades of archaeological research. That uncertainty begins with the city's overall size. Philippi occupies approximately 68 hectares within its fortified circuit, yet archaeological evidence indicates that urban activity extended beyond the most intensively excavated areas. Founded as Crenides during the 4th century BCE, before being transformed by Philip II of Macedon and later refounded as a Roman colonia following the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE, the settlement developed over many centuries through repeated phases of expansion and reconstruction. The monuments visible today primarily belong to the Roman and early Byzantine periods, but they occupy only selected areas that could be investigated without disturbing modern agricultural land. Between these exposed monuments lie extensive zones that have never undergone large-scale excavation, leaving archaeologists unable to reconstruct the complete urban layout or determine how residential districts, commercial quarters, workshops, warehouses, and public services were organized across the city. Remote sensing repeatedly identifies buried walls, streets, and rectangular building foundations beneath cultivated fields, suggesting that much of the lower city survives almost intact below the surface. Yet these discoveries remain outlines rather than excavated architecture. The deeper researchers investigate Philippi, the more another unresolved problem emerges beneath the streets themselves. Water made the city's existence possible, but the hydraulic system responsible for supplying and draining the settlement remains only partially understood. Philippi was established near abundant springs at the foot of Mount Orbelos and beside the fertile Philippi Plain, where groundwater has always been plentiful. Excavated sectors preserve stone-built drainage channels, covered sewers, wells, reservoirs, and carefully engineered conduits designed to control both fresh water and seasonal flooding. These features demonstrate advanced hydraulic planning that evolved from the Hellenistic period into the Roman Empire and continued during the Byzantine era. However, almost every documented section eventually disappears beneath unexcavated ground, preventing archaeologists from tracing the complete network. Individual drains can be followed for only limited distances before they vanish below later deposits or modern farmland, leaving fundamental questions unanswered. No complete map exists showing how the various channels connected to one another, how water distribution was coordinated across the lower city, or whether separate hydraulic systems served different phases of urban expansion. The visible infrastructure appears too sophisticated to have functioned as isolated installations, Yet the buried connections that would explain the system remain inaccessible. This uncertainty has become even more significant as modern geophysical investigations continue identifying anomalies beneath areas that have never been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry reveal linear features consistent with buried streets, drainage corridors, and masonry walls extending well beyond exposed excavation trenches. Some anomalies appear to align with known sewer lines, raising the possibility that substantial sections of the underground hydraulic network remain perfectly preserved beneath accumulated sediments. Without excavation, however, archaeologists cannot determine whether these features represent major collectors, secondary drains, water distribution channels, or entirely different structures. Even basic questions such as the dimensions, construction methods, maintenance access, and chronological development of the underground network remain unresolved because the critical evidence still lies beneath untouched ground. Unlike monumental buildings that can be interpreted from standing architecture, buried hydraulic systems reveal their engineering logic only when complete connections are exposed, and those connections largely remain hidden. The geology of the Philippi Plain adds another layer to the mystery. Over nearly 2,000 years, rivers descending from the surrounding mountains repeatedly deposited thick layers of alluvium across the landscape, while seasonal flooding gradually altered local drainage patterns. Geological studies indicate that archaeological levels in some parts of the lower city now lie several meters below the modern ground surface, buried beneath successive episodes of sediment accumulation. In practical terms, this means that significant portions of ancient Philippi may remain exceptionally well preserved simply because natural processes sealed them beneath protective deposits before later occupation could disturb them. At the same time, those same deposits dramatically increase the cost and complexity of excavation. Every meter of overlying sediment must be removed before archaeologists even reach Roman or Hellenistic occupation layers, making extensive investigation across dozens of hectares financially and logistically unrealistic. Consequently, many of the most promising areas identified by geophysical survey remain untouched, despite their obvious archaeological potential. The relationship between the visible Roman city and the earlier Greek settlement introduces another unanswered question. Before becoming the celebrated Roman colonia, Philippi existed as Crenides, a Macedonian foundation established to control nearby mineral resources and strategic routes linking Europe and Asia. Later Roman rebuilding transformed much of the urban landscape, constructing monumental civic architecture directly above earlier occupation levels. Because excavation has concentrated on the later city, comparatively little is known about how much of Crenides survives beneath Roman foundations within the lower city. Archaeologists suspect that deeply buried Greek streets, domestic buildings, and public spaces may remain preserved below later construction, but reaching those levels would require removing substantial Roman remains, creating difficult conservation decisions. As a result, the earliest urban history of Philippi remains partially concealed beneath the very monuments that made the site internationally famous. This incomplete picture extends to the people who actually lived there. Visitors encounter basilicas, administrative buildings, the forum, the theatre, and imposing city walls, yet these monuments represented only a small fraction of daily urban life. A prosperous Roman colonia, occupying such a strategic position along the Via Egnatia, must have supported thousands of ordinary residents living in houses, operating workshops, storing agricultural products, repairing equipment, conducting trade, and maintaining the infrastructure that kept the city functioning. Most of those neighborhoods remain buried within the lower city. Without large-scale excavation, archaeologists cannot accurately estimate residential density, identify specialized industrial districts, reconstruct patterns of economic activity, or determine how different social groups occupied the expanding settlement through successive centuries. The city that survives above ground therefore reflects primarily its monumental public face, while the urban landscape experienced by most inhabitants still lies hidden below the fields. In the rocky hills of central Tanzania, hundreds of ancient paintings still cling to stone surfaces after thousands of years. Wind, rain, heat, and time should have erased them long ago, yet the images remain. The greatest mystery of Kondoa is not what was painted, but how the paint survived. The Kondoa rock art sites are located in central Tanzania, covering hundreds of shelters and rock overhangs across an area of thousands of square kilometers. Although local communities had known about the paintings for generations, systematic archaeological documentation expanded during the 20th century, eventually revealing one of the largest concentrations of prehistoric rock art in Africa. Modern paint exposed to the elements often begins deteriorating within decades. An ancient paint exposed directly to sunlight, seasonal rainfall, biological growth, and temperature fluctuations should disappear even faster. Yet many paintings at Kondoa remain visible after periods that may exceed several thousand years, creating one of the most fascinating technological mysteries in African archaeology. Scientists have identified some of the pigments used by ancient artists, with red colors commonly produced from hematite-rich ochre, white pigments likely coming from kaolin clay and other mineral sources, and black pigments often derived from carbon-based materials or manganese compounds. However, knowing the pigment does not solve the mystery, because pigment alone does not explain survival. A pile of crushed hematite placed on exposed stone would quickly wash away, meaning something else had to hold these particles together and bond them to the rock surface. Researchers suspect that ancient artists mixed pigments with binders such as plant gums, tree resins, animal fat, blood, egg-like substances, or combinations of organic materials. But the problem is that organic compounds degrade over time, leaving little evidence behind. Thousands of years later, archaeologists can often identify the mineral component, but struggle to reconstruct the complete chemical recipe. This challenge is not unique to Kondoa, as similar questions surround the paintings of Lascaux in France, Altamira in Spain, and Australia's Aboriginal rock art traditions. Yet, Kondoa presents an especially intriguing case because many paintings survived in an environment far more exposed than deep cave systems. The result is a scientific paradox. Modern laboratories can identify microscopic mineral particles and measure chemical compositions with extraordinary precision, yet the exact formula that allowed some paintings to survive for millennia remains uncertain. The artist may have possessed practical knowledge of chemistry that was never written down and has now vanished completely. The survival of the paintings raises another question about how much the artists understood about the materials they were using. Modern materials scientists know that pigment durability depends on numerous factors such as particle size, mineral composition, surface roughness, moisture exposure, chemical stability, and temperature fluctuations. Remarkably, many Kondoa paintings appear on surfaces that naturally promote preservation, with some rock faces showing relatively limited water runoff, others protected beneath natural overhangs, and certain surfaces possessing textures that help pigments penetrate microscopic pores in the rock. Today, geologists can analyze these properties using advanced instruments, but ancient artists had no such technology. Yet they repeatedly selected locations that turned out to be among the most stable surfaces available. This raises the question of whether it was simple coincidence, or whether generations of observation allowed ancient communities to recognize which rock surfaces would preserve images for the longest periods? If so, the painters may have developed a practical form of geological knowledge through centuries of experimentation. One of the least discussed mysteries of Kondoa involves the placement of the paintings themselves. The region contains countless rock surfaces suitable for drawing, yet ancient artists repeatedly chose specific shelters and overhangs. Many of these locations share common characteristics such as protection from direct rainfall, stable geological formations, broad visibility across surrounding landscapes, and natural acoustic effects. This pattern suggests deliberate selection rather than random decoration. Researchers have noted similar behaviours at prehistoric sites around the world, where, in Europe, Paleolithic artists frequently painted deep cave chambers, and in Australia, Aboriginal artists often selected locations with cultural and environmental significance. At Kondoa, the repeated preference for certain geological settings suggests a sophisticated understanding of place, though the question remains whether this understanding emerged through spiritual traditions, practical observation, or some combination of both. Although many Kondoa paintings depict people, animals, hunting scenes, and ritual activities, others feature geometric designs whose meanings remain uncertain. Researchers have documented parallel line networks, circular patterns, grid-like structures, symmetrical motifs, and repeating abstract symbols, with some designs displaying surprising consistency and proportional balance. Creating symmetrical geometric forms without rulers, measuring devices, or drafting tools is far more difficult than it appears, as even slight errors become visible when repeated patterns cover large surfaces. This raises an intriguing possibility about whether these were merely decorative motifs, or visual representations of information, ritual knowledge, territorial markers, cosmological concepts, or symbolic systems now lost to history. The answer remains unknown. Another unusual pattern has attracted increasing scientific attention, as several rock art sites worldwide appear associated with distinctive acoustic environments, where certain chambers produce echoes, amplifications, or resonance effects that differ significantly from surrounding areas. Investigations at numerous prehistoric locations have revealed correlations between sound behavior and artistic activity, and some Kondoa shelters also exhibit notable acoustic properties. Standing within these spaces, voices can reverberate unexpectedly. Certain sounds carry farther than anticipated, and echoes reflect from surrounding stone surfaces in unusual ways. Researchers continue debating whether this relationship is meaningful, questioning whether ancient communities intentionally chose locations because of their sound characteristics, or whether the connection is merely accidental. If intentional, it would suggest a sophisticated understanding of environmental acoustics long before formal science emerged. One of the most remarkable aspects of Kondoa is the evidence for repeated use over enormous spans of time, as many shelters contain multiple layers of paintings. New images were often placed over older ones, and in some cases archaeologists have identified several artistic phases separated by centuries or even millennia. This creates another mystery regarding how knowledge of these locations survived for so long. Maintaining cultural continuity across hundreds of years is difficult, and preserving traditions across thousands of years is extraordinary. The repeated return to the same site suggests that knowledge was transmitted through generations with remarkable accuracy, possibly through stories, rituals, oral traditions, and cultural memory functioning as a sophisticated information storage system capable of preserving important locations long before written records existed. Exactly how this transmission occurred remains uncertain. High in the northern Andes of Peru, More than 2,300 meters above sea level lies Kuntur Wasi, a ceremonial center older than the Inca, older than Machu Picchu, and home to engineering mysteries that modern archaeology still struggles to explain. Although local communities had long known of the site, systematic archaeological investigations during the 20th century revealed a monumental ceremonial complex dating roughly between 1200 and 50 BCE and 50 BCE, where excavations uncovered temples, underground galleries, sophisticated stone architecture, and some of the most remarkable ancient gold artifacts ever found in the Andes. At first glance, Kuntur Wasi seems modest compared with famous sites such as Machu Picchu, Teotihuacan, or Petra. Yet archaeologists quickly realized that its importance lies not in its size, but in its technological sophistication. The site emerged during a period when much of the Andean world was still developing large-scale ceremonial architecture, yet the builders of Kuntur Wasi were already manipulating stone, controlling water, creating underground structures, and producing luxury metal objects with a degree of skill that appears surprisingly advanced for the era. Radiocarbon dating places major phases of construction between approximately 800 and 200 BCE, meaning many of the site's achievements predate the Roman Empire, the Great Wall of China, and numerous classical civilizations often associated with monumental engineering. The deeper researchers investigate Kuntur Wasi, the more a difficult question emerges: where did this knowledge come from? One of the most striking features of Kuntur Wasi is its stone architecture, where many blocks display carefully flattened surfaces and deliberate shaping. While they do not reach the extreme polygonal precision later seen at Sacsayhuaman, they demonstrate a level of planning that required far more than simple trial and error. The challenge becomes apparent when considering the available technology, as there is no evidence that the builders possessed iron tools, steel was completely unknown, and most tools were likely made from stone hammers, harder rocks, and early copper-based implements. Modern experiments show that shaping volcanic or sedimentary stone using such tools is possible, but achieving consistency across large construction projects demands extensive knowledge of materials and technique. Researchers can explain how an individual block might have been carved, yet what remains less clear is how entire generations developed standardized construction methods capable of producing complex ceremonial architecture over centuries. The problem resembles questions raised at Stonehenge, Göbekli Tepe, and early Egyptian monuments, where the structures themselves survive but the educational system that trained the builders does not. Beneath portions of the ceremonial complex are underground galleries and chambers, and although constructing underground spaces may sound simple today, it presents serious engineering challenges because every roof must withstand enormous pressure from the earth above, and even minor miscalculations can lead to collapse. Yet, many of Kuntur Wasi's subterranean structures remained stable for centuries. Modern engineers calculate such loads using mathematical models, geological surveys, and structural analysis software. But ancient builders possessed none of these tools. Nevertheless, they somehow determined wall thicknesses, support geometry, and stone placement accurately enough to preserve these spaces for more than 2 millennia. This raises an uncomfortable question for archaeology. Were these achievements the result of accumulated practical experience spanning hundreds of years? Or did the builders possess a systematic understanding of structural behavior that has been lost? The answer remains uncertain. The Andes experience dramatic seasonal rainfall variations, and without proper drainage, ceremonial centers built from earth and stone would rapidly deteriorate because water infiltration can weaken foundations, destabilize slopes, and destroy architectural features. Excavations at Kuntur Wasi have revealed evidence of drainage channels, and carefully prepared construction surfaces designed to control runoff, which from an engineering perspective is extremely significant. Effective drainage requires understanding gradients, water flow patterns, and long-term erosion processes, and modern civil engineers still devote substantial effort to solving these problems. The builders of Kuntur-Wasi appear to have solved them through observation and experience. Yet, what remains unknown is the exact method they used to predict water behavior across the site. No written manuals survive, no mathematical records exist, yet the results suggest knowledge that was both practical and highly effective. Among the most recognizable discoveries at Kuntur-Wasi are large stone sculptures and carved monoliths, several of which feature complex iconography associated with elite ritual traditions, and their craftsmanship indicates highly specialized artisans capable of maintaining symmetry and detail across large surfaces. The engineering challenge begins long before carving, as many stones had to be extracted, transported, positioned, and erected in mountainous terrain. Even today, moving multi-ton blocks across steep landscapes requires planning, labor coordination, and mechanical advantage. Researchers estimate that transporting such stones would have demanded organized workforces and carefully designed logistics systems. Comparable mysteries appear at Tiwanaku in Bolivia, the Moai platforms of Easter Island, and certain megalithic structures in Europe. The question is not whether ancient people could move large stones, as the evidence proves they could, but the mystery lies in how they repeatedly accomplished these feats with such consistency. Perhaps the most fascinating technological mystery at Kuntur-Wasi comes not from its stone architecture but from its gold, as excavations uncovered an astonishing collection of ceremonial gold artifacts, including crowns, ornaments, pectorals, earrings, and ritual objects associated with elite burials, some of which date to nearly 2,500 years ago. What makes them remarkable is not merely their age but their sophistication, as metallurgical analyses show evidence of advanced metalworking techniques, including hammering, annealing, shaping, polishing, and the controlled manipulation of precious metals. Annealing is particularly important, as this process involves heating metal to specific temperatures and then cooling it to restore workability. And without proper temperature control, gold can become difficult to shape or suffer structural weaknesses. Modern metalworkers monitor such processes using thermometers and precise equipment, yet ancient craftsmen possessed neither, and still microscopic examinations indicate that Kuntur-Wasi artisans repeatedly achieved successful results. Even more surprising is the thinness of certain gold sheets, as some decorative elements required transforming relatively small amounts of metal into broad, visually impressive surfaces while avoiding tears or fractures, which demands an intimate understanding of material behavior. Comparisons with contemporary cultures reveal that Kuntur-Wasi belonged to a select group of early societies developing sophisticated metallurgy, with similar advances appearing in parts of the Near East, Egypt, and later Mediterranean civilizations. However, unlike those regions, the Andes developed metallurgy independently, meaning Kuntur-Wasi's craftsmen were not simply copying foreign technology, but were creating their own. The greatest mystery is how such specialized knowledge was transmitted, as no technical manuals survive and no instructional texts exist. Archaeologists can analyze the finished objects, but reconstructing the complete manufacturing sequence remains extraordinarily difficult. And in many ways, the gold artifacts represent a lost science, demonstrating mastery while concealing the learning process that made that mastery possible. Researchers have long debated whether the layout of Kuntur-Wasi incorporated astronomical alignments, as several architectural elements appear oriented towards significant solar positions along the horizon. and if intentional, such alignments would require decades of observation. Ancient observers would need to track seasonal movements of the sun, identify recurring patterns, and integrate those patterns into construction plans. Similar debates surround Stonehenge, Chichen Itza, Machu Picchu, and Newgrange, where the challenge is distinguishing deliberate design from coincidence. At Kuntawasi, evidence suggests at least some relationship between architecture and celestial observation, but the full extent remains uncertain. North of Xi'an, China, lies an underground empire more than 2,000 years old. Hidden beneath layers of earth, Hanyangling appears at first to be another imperial tomb. Yet the deeper archaeologists dig, the more they uncover evidence of engineering knowledge that remains only partially understood. From mass-produced terracotta figures to mysterious underground environmental control systems, Hanyangling raises an unsettling question. How did ancient builders achieve such technical sophistication without leaving behind the knowledge that made it possible? Construction work near Xi'an in the 1970s revealed unexpected underground structures, and subsequent excavations identified the site as the mausoleum complex of Emperor Jing of Han, who ruled China between 157 and 141 BCE. What initially appeared to be a royal tomb soon proved to be one of the largest and most technologically intriguing archaeological sites of the Western Han dynasty. Modern surveys reveal that Hanyangling was never intended to be merely a burial chamber, but rather an entire underground landscape. The mausoleum complex covers dozens of square kilometers and includes the emperor's tomb, the empress's tomb, ceremonial areas, storage pits, workshops, roads, and hundreds of subsidiary burial features, all demonstrating a remarkable level of spatial organization. Many structures align with consistent directional orientations across large distances, suggesting advanced surveying methods. Today, engineers achieve such precision using satellite positioning, laser measurements, and digital mapping, yet Han Dynasty planners possessed none of these technologies. Still, the geometric consistency of the site suggests a sophisticated understanding of measurement, alignment, and large-scale project planning. The challenge becomes even more remarkable when considering the terrain, as maintaining accurate positioning across a vast construction zone requires controlling cumulative measurement errors, where even small mistakes can become significant when multiplied across kilometers of construction. Somehow, the builders achieved a level of coordination that allowed separate teams to create an integrated underground complex functioning as a unified design, raising a mystery that remains difficult to answer because archaeologists can measure the final result, but the methods used to create it remain largely invisible. Among the most extraordinary discoveries at Hanyangling are tens of thousands of miniature terracotta figures, which, unlike the famous life-sized warriors of Qin Shi Huang, are significantly smaller, typically measuring between 50 and 60 centimeters in height, with many originally wearing real silk clothing and carrying wooden arms that have long since decayed. At first glance, the figures appear simple, but closer examination reveals something astonishing, as researchers have identified evidence suggesting standardized production methods in which heads, torsos, arms, and legs appear to have been manufactured separately and assembled later. Certain facial features and body proportions recur with striking consistency, and tool marks indicate repetitive manufacturing processes rather than entirely individual sculpting. This has led some scholars to compare the production system to a primitive assembly line, a comparison that is remarkable because large-scale standardized manufacturing is often associated with much later historical periods. Yet Hanyangling suggests that craftsmen more than 2 millennia ago may have developed efficient production techniques capable of generating enormous quantities of highly consistent artifacts. The question is not whether they succeeded, as the evidence proves they did, but rather how the production system was organized, including how quality standards were maintained, how molds were distributed, and how thousands of components were coordinated before final assembly. The physical objects survive, but the manufacturing knowledge does not. Perhaps the most intriguing engineering puzzle at Han Yangling lies beneath the artifacts themselves, as many burial pits preserved organic materials far better than expected for structures more than 2,000 years old. Fragments of textiles, wood residues, pigments, and delicate materials survived in environments that should have accelerated decay, leading scientists studying the site to point toward a combination of factors. Depth played a role, soil composition played a role, groundwater behavior played a role, and oxygen availability likely influenced preservation, with these factors together creating stable underground microenvironments capable of slowing destructive biological and chemical processes. The remarkable aspect is not that such conditions existed, but that they appear repeatedly. Modern conservation science recognizes that stable temperature, controlled humidity, and limited oxygen exposure significantly reduce deterioration, and museums spend enormous resources maintaining these conditions artificially. Yet Han Yangling seems to have achieved comparable environmental stability through architecture and geology alone. Some burial chambers remained remarkably consistent despite seasonal weather changes occurring above ground, as thick layers of earth functioned as natural thermal insulation. Certain soil compositions may have regulated moisture movement, and burial depth reduced temperature fluctuations that would otherwise accelerate material degradation. The question is whether these effects were intentional, raising further inquiries about whether Han engineers understood enough about underground environments to design preservation systems deliberately, or whether they were unknowingly benefiting from favorable geological conditions. This distinction is important because deliberate environmental control would imply a practical understanding of soil physics, groundwater dynamics, airflow behavior, and long-term material preservation far beyond what historians usually associate with ancient engineering. Modern instruments can measure humidity gradients and thermal behavior inside excavation zones, and model oxygen diffusion and moisture transport through soil layers, yet these tools still cannot determine with certainty whether the ancient builders intentionally engineered the microclimate. As a result, Han Yangling occupies a fascinating position between archaeology and environmental engineering, demonstrating that effective preservation occurred while not fully explaining how much the builders understood about the processes responsible. The burial pits themselves present another challenge, as many extend tens of meters in length and require the removal of enormous quantities of earth. The region around Xi'an is dominated by loess, a fine-grained sediment known for both its stability and its unpredictability, as it can stand in steep vertical faces under certain conditions, yet also collapse catastrophically when moisture changes weaken its structure. Modern geotechnical engineers rely on soil testing, mathematical modeling, and stability calculations before excavating large underground spaces. But Han Dynasty builders had no such tools. Nevertheless, the pits at Han Yangling were constructed successfully and remained intact for centuries, implying an accumulated body of practical knowledge regarding soil behavior. Builders appear to have understood how deep excavations could safely proceed, how walls should be shaped, and how structural failure could be minimized. This challenge resembles mysteries seen elsewhere in the ancient world, as engineers studying the underground city of Derinkuyu in Turkey, the rock-cut architecture of Petra, and the subterranean complexes beneath Egypt encounter similar questions, where the structures exist but the practical knowledge that created them has largely disappeared. Which mystery of Hanyangling fascinates you most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Along the Red Sea Escarpment, on a wind-exposed plateau more than 2,600 meters above sea level, Quahito at first appears to be a modest cluster of ruins. But beneath that simplicity lies a contradiction. Here, in an environment defined by water scarcity, thermal stress and erosion, ancient builders created a settlement that not only endured, but operated with a level of engineering logic comparable to far more advanced civilizations. The most unsettling mystery is not what was built, but how every part of the system seems to solve problems with an efficiency that should not have been possible with the tools and knowledge of its time. Although local populations had long known of the ruins, Quahito entered formal archaeological awareness in the early 20th century, during surveys of the Eritrean highlands conducted under Italian colonial administration. Subsequent expeditions throughout the 20th century mapped the plateau, revealing an extensive network of terraces, reservoirs, temples, and domestic structures spread across several square kilometers. Artifacts recovered, including inscriptions in the South Arabian script and architectural parallels, linked the site to the Kingdom of Aksum, a major trading power between roughly the 1st and 7th centuries CE. Yet even with this cultural attribution, the technological coherence of Quahito remained unexplained. Excavations produced fragments of a civilization but not the blueprint behind it. The defining constraint of Quahito is water. The plateau lacks any permanent river, and modern rainfall averages between approximately 300 and 500 millimeters annually, highly seasonal and unreliable. Yet archaeological evidence indicates a settlement capable of supporting a substantial population. At the center of this paradox stands the Saphira Dam, an ancient structure designed to capture and store runoff from rare rain events. Combined with rock-cut cisterns and channel systems, the plateau forms an integrated hydraulic network. Estimates suggest that even a modest reservoir capacity of several thousand cubic meters could sustain hundreds, possibly thousands of inhabitants if managed efficiently. This implies not only construction capability, but hydrological foresight understanding runoff patterns, evaporation rates, and storage efficiency. Comparatively, Roman cistern systems such as those in North Africa relied on similar principles, but were typically supported by formalized surveying tools, standardized measurements, and written engineering traditions. At Quahito, no such documentation has been found. The system exists, functions logically, yet lacks an identifiable knowledge framework. The architecture of Quahito is dominated by dry stone masonry, carefully shaped blocks assembled without mortar. This technique is widespread in ancient construction, from Mediterranean terraces to Andean walls. However, the execution here introduces a critical anomaly. Stone blocks are fitted with remarkable precision, reducing voids and enhancing structural stability. In many locations, walls remain standing after nearly 2,000 years of exposure. The precision suggests controlled shaping, yet there is limited evidence of advanced metal tools typically associated with such work. From an engineering standpoint, such tight-fitting construction reduces internal stress distribution and increases resistance to lateral forces, including wind and minor seismic activity. But this raises a question of intent. In a resource-limited environment, why invest labor into achieving a level of precision beyond what is structurally necessary? This pattern echoes other ancient sites such as Inca stonework at Machu Picchu, where precision appears to exceed immediate functional requirements. In both cases, the construction implies a deeper understanding of material behavior than the archaeological record clearly supports. The most difficult mystery to reconcile is not structural design, but material survival. High-altitude plateau environments impose extreme stress on stone construction. Daily temperature fluctuations can exceed 20 degrees Celsius, producing cycles of thermal expansion and contraction. Over time, this leads to microfracturing, displacement, and eventual collapse, particularly in dry masonry systems lacking binding agents. Wind erosion further accelerates degradation, especially in exposed terrains such as Kauhaito. Under such conditions, many ancient dry stone structures elsewhere show significant collapse within centuries. Yet at Kauhaito, numerous walls and terraces remain partially intact after nearly 2 millennia. Stones show limited displacement. Structural lines remain coherent. In some cases, surface textures suggest deliberate shaping or finishing that may influence weather resistance. From a material science perspective, durability at this scale implies one or more of the following: careful selection of lithology, choosing stone types with low porosity and high Macaulay to thermal stress; optimization of block geometry, minimizing stress concentrations and improving load distribution; possible surface treatment, whether through polishing, heat exposure, or other unknown methods that alter erosion rates. The absence of binding material makes this even more striking. Stability emerges purely from geometry, mass, and friction. When compared to other ancient sites exposed to similar climates such as dry stone settlements in the Levant or North Africa, Kauhaito's preservation appears disproportionate. It does not simply survive. It persists beyond what environmental models would predict. Beyond individual structures, the plateau reveals signs of coordinated planning. Terraces are aligned to maximize land use and possibly control runoff. Pathways connect elevated and lower zones efficiently. Architectural clusters suggest zoning, domestic, ceremonial, and possibly administrative. Such organization implies a systemic approach to settlement design. Yet, unlike Roman or Mesopotamian contexts, there is no surviving body of written engineering instructions, measurement systems, or architectural treatises associated with the site. This absence creates a paradox. The physical evidence indicates planning. The historical record does not preserve the process. Kauhaito is often interpreted as part of the broader Aksumite world, a civilization known for trade networks extending across the Red Sea and into the Mediterranean. However, even within that context, the plateau stands apart. Its solutions are highly localized, tailored to a specific environmental constraint. Its engineering is efficient, but not visibly derived from known traditions. And most importantly, its knowledge system, whatever produced it, has left almost no trace. There is no gradual progression visible in the archaeological layers that leads clearly to this level of integration. Instead, the system appears already functional, already optimized. So how did a system this coherent exist, without leaving behind the knowledge that made it possible? What do you think explains Kauhaito's engineering, lost knowledge, overlooked science, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Overlooking the Guadalbolon Valley near Jaén in southern Spain stands an ancient Iberian city that may preserve one of the most precise solar alignments ever discovered in pre-Roman Europe. At Puente Tablas, a gate built more than 2,500 years ago, appears to have been designed to capture the sunrise of the winter solstice with astonishing accuracy, and the structure still works today, raising the question of how its builders achieved it. Although the hill had long been known locally, systematic archaeological excavations began during the late 20th century, revealing not a simple settlement but a fortified Iberian oppidum, covering roughly 6 hectares and occupied primarily between the 7th and 4th centuries BCE. Excavations uncovered houses, defensive walls, ritual spaces, towers, and eventually a discovery that transformed the site into one of the most important archaeological mysteries in Spain, as the eastern gate of the city appeared to be aligned with a specific astronomical event. At first, this seemed unlikely because ancient gates are often oriented according to terrain, defense, or convenience, yet repeated observations suggested something far more deliberate. Every year around the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, the rising sun appears on the southeastern horizon at its most southerly point, and at Puente Tablas, archaeologists observe that sunlight entering through the eastern gate follows a carefully controlled path and illuminates a sacred area beyond the entrance, a phenomenon that occurs only during a narrow seasonal window and carries extraordinary implications. To understand why, consider the challenge facing ancient engineers, as the position of sunrise changes every day throughout the year, and at the latitude of Jaén, approximately 38 degrees north, the sunrise point shifts across a large section of the horizon between summer and winter, meaning that identifying the precise position of the winter solstice requires years of observation. Unlike modern astronomers, the Iberians possessed no telescopes, precision optics, GPS systems, digital clocks, or computerized models, yet the gate alignment appears intentional. Researchers studying the site have suggested that the builders may have tracked solar movements for generations before construction began, requiring a sophisticated tradition of astronomical knowledge passed from one generation to another. The mystery becomes deeper when compared with other ancient solar monuments, such as the famous Passage Tomb of Newgrange in Ireland, which captures sunrise during the winter solstice, Stonehenge, which aligns with important solar events, and the temples of ancient Egypt, which often incorporated astronomical orientations. Yet Puente Tablas belongs to a civilization that left far fewer written records, and although the monument demonstrates a level of astronomical precision comparable to some of the most famous ceremonial sites in the ancient world, the knowledge system behind it remains largely invisible. Questions remain unanswered, including how Iberian builders determined the correct angle, how many years of observations were required, whether they used fixed markers on surrounding hills, and whether specialized astronomer priests were responsible for the measurements, as no definitive answers have emerged. At first glance, the eastern gate appears defensive, but closer examination reveals a more complex design in which the entrance forces movement through controlled pathways, preventing approaching visitors from walking straight into the city and instead manipulating visibility, movement, and perspective. This combination of military and ceremonial functions presents another puzzle, as modern architects often separate sacred and defensive spaces, yet at Puente Tablas they seem deliberately integrated. The builders created an entrance capable of controlling armies while simultaneously functioning as a giant astronomical instrument, demonstrating remarkably sophisticated dual-purpose engineering. And even more surprising is that no surviving Iberian text explains how the design process worked, leaving the structure intact but the methodology unknown. Building an astronomical alignment requires much more than observing the sun, as it also requires surveying, and while today surveyors rely on laser instruments, satellite positioning systems, total stations and digital elevation models capable of measuring terrain with centimetre-level precision, the engineers of Puente Tablas possessed none of these technologies. Nevertheless, the city occupies a strategically selected hilltop overlooking the surrounding valley, with defensive walls following terrain contours efficiently, access routes carefully controlled, and visibility across the landscape maximized. This raises an important question about how ancient surveyors measured angles, elevations, distances, and sightlines accurately enough to combine military requirements with astronomical precision. Experimental archaeologists have attempted to reproduce ancient surveying methods, using ropes, wooden stakes, plumb lines, and observation poles. And while such techniques can achieve impressive results, reproducing the exact accuracy seen at Puente Table remains challenging, suggesting that the final structure reflects knowledge far beyond simple trial and error. Excavations revealed that the city was protected by substantial fortifications, with walls, towers, gates, and restricted access points working together as a coordinated defensive system. Military historians often compare effective ancient fortifications to mechanical devices in which every component serves a specific function, and removing one element weakens the entire defensive strategy. And Puente Table appears to follow this principle as the gate channels movement. The walls exploit natural terrain, and the towers extend observation range, allowing the entire system to operate as an integrated design. What remains unclear is how such knowledge developed, as many ancient societies improved defenses gradually over centuries through warfare and adaptation. Yet parts of Puente Tablas appear surprisingly mature from an engineering perspective, giving the impression that builders already understood sophisticated defensive concepts before construction began, leaving the origin of that expertise unanswered by archaeology. One of the most overlooked mysteries at Puente Tablas concerns urban organization, as excavations indicate that residential zones, public areas, defensive structures and ritual spaces were not randomly distributed, but instead formed an organized urban landscape. This challenges older assumptions about Iberian settlements, since for decades many scholars viewed pre-Roman Iberian communities as relatively simple compared with later Roman cities. Yet Puente Tablas suggests otherwise by demonstrating evidence of planning, coordination, and long-term development. Roads connect key areas efficiently, important buildings occupy strategic locations, and public and sacred spaces appear intentionally separated. Principles that modern urban planners would immediately recognize, yet no surviving documents explain how ancient planners made these decisions, leaving the city itself as the only surviving blueprint. What do you think was the true secret behind Puente Tablas' Solar Gate? Generations of astronomical observation, a lost surveying technique, or a forgotten scientific tradition? Share your theory in the comments below. Perched atop a flat-topped sandstone plateau in northern Ethiopia, the Debre Damo monastery rises more than 15 meters above sheer vertical cliffs, cut off from the surrounding world in a way that seems almost deliberate. The only way up is by a leather rope lowered from above, a method that has remained unchanged for centuries and still defines access to the site today. According to historical tradition, the monastery was established in the 6th century CE by Abuna Aragawi, one of the 9 saints credited with spreading Christianity across the region. By the 19th century, European explorers and missionaries had already documented the same astonishing detail: a single rope, hauled by monks, functioning as the only entry point to a fully developed religious complex. From the very beginning, Debre Damo presents a contradiction. Religious centers are typically designed to gather communities, to be seen, to be reached. This one was built to resist access to exist apart from it. And yet, for nearly 1,500 years, it has not only survived, but remained continuously inhabited. What makes Debre Damo truly mysterious is not just its isolation, but the unanswered question at its core. How is a permanent, complex structure constructed on a plateau that appears, even today, almost impossible to reach? Unlike pilgrimage centers such as Machu Picchu or fortified heights like Sigiriya, which incorporate engineered pathways, terraces, or carved staircases, Debre Damo offers no such accommodations. The vertical cliff surrounding the plateau is approximately 15 to 25 meters high, composed of weathered sandstone with minimal natural footholds. The rope ascent still used today requires upper body strength, coordination, and assistance from above. This raises a structural paradox. Archaeological patterns show that ancient builders typically optimized accessibility during construction phases, even if later restricted. At Debre Damo, however, there is no evidence of a former staircase, ramp, or carved access route that was later removed or destroyed. Geological surveys of similar sandstone escarpments indicate erosion rates on the order of fractions of a millimeter per year. Even over 1,000 years, such erosion would not fully erase a large-scale carved staircase without leaving detectable remnants. Yet none have been conclusively identified. The implication is unsettling. Either the builders constructed the site under conditions vastly different from today, or they employed temporary systems that left virtually no trace. The most persistent mystery surrounding Debre Damo lies in what might be called the plateau construction problem. The monastery complex includes stone walls, timber beams, roofing materials, and interior structures consistent with early Aksumite civilization architectural techniques. Some wooden beams, particularly the distinctive monkey head projections, are integral load-bearing elements. To construct even a modest building, several tons of material would have been required. Timber beams alone could weigh hundreds of kilograms each. Stone blocks, depending on size and density, would add significantly more. In other ancient sites, the logistics of vertical transport are well documented. At Machu Picchu, laborers used inclined ramps and switchback trails. At Sigiriya, engineers carved stairways directly into the rock face. Even in extreme environments, such as cliff dwellings in the American Southwest, access routes, however narrow, were always present. At Debre Damo, none of these solutions appear to exist. One hypothesis suggests the use of rope and pulley systems. However, for such systems to lift heavy loads consistently, they typically require stable anchor points, scaffolding, or mechanical advantage devices such as compound pulleys. There is no surviving evidence of such infrastructure on the plateau edges or below. Another theory proposes that construction occurred gradually, with materials lifted in smaller increments. While plausible, this introduces further complications. Repeated lifting of heavy materials over a vertical drop of 15 to 20 meters would require a coordinated labor force and durable rope technology. Experimental archaeology offers some insight. Tests with leather ropes and simple pulley systems suggest that lifting loads exceeding 100 kilograms vertically becomes increasingly difficult without advanced mechanical advantage. Yet the scale of construction at Debre Damo implies cumulative loads far beyond that threshold. A third possibility is that temporary wooden scaffolding or earthen ramps once existed and were later removed or eroded. However, sediment analysis around the base of the plateau has not revealed clear evidence of large-scale artificial ramp structures. The result is a logistical gap. There is no fully satisfactory explanation for how the necessary construction materials reached the plateau in the first place. Despite these uncertainties, the monastery has endured for over 14 centuries. The architectural style reflects Aksumite construction methods, characterized by alternating layers of stone and timber. This hybrid approach distributes stress and allows flexibility under environmental pressure. The projecting wooden beams, often visible on exterior walls, serve both structural and aesthetic functions. From an engineering perspective, such designs can enhance resilience. Modern studies of similar composite systems show improved resistance to cracking and seismic stress compared to rigid stone-only construction. However, Debre Damo's environment presents additional challenges. Elevated plateaus experience stronger wind exposure, temperature fluctuations, and accelerated weathering. Wood, in particular, is vulnerable to decay, insects, and moisture. Yet some original structural elements have survived for centuries, suggesting either exceptional material selection or maintenance practices that are not fully documented. Comparatively, many ancient structures built at ground level have suffered greater degradation. This raises another question. Did the isolation of the plateau, rather than hindering preservation, actually protect the site from human interference and environmental damage? Debre Damo is not merely a construction puzzle. It is a sustained human environment. The plateau spans a limited area, yet it has supported a monastic community for generations. Food, water, and supplies must be transported upward, while agricultural activity on the plateau itself is constrained. Anthropological comparisons with other isolated communities, such as monastic settlements on Mount Athos in Greece, reveal similarities in social structure, but significant differences in physical accessibility. Mount Athos, while restricted, remains reachable by land and sea. Debre Damo does not. This level of isolation suggests intentional design. The monastery functions as a controlled environment, limiting external contact and preserving religious traditions with minimal disruption. From a systems perspective, it resembles a self-regulating enclave where constraints reinforce continuity, but it also amplifies the original mystery. Juzo and Comte A. Few, why invest such effort to create a site that is inherently difficult to sustain? The founding legend of Abuna Aragawi describes his ascent aided by a giant serpent, a narrative that transforms an impossible climb into a divine act. While clearly symbolic, such stories often encode real challenges in mythological form. Across cultures, extraordinary engineering feats are frequently attributed to supernatural assistance when the underlying techniques are not understood or have been forgotten. In this sense, the legend may not explain the construction of Debre Damo, but it acknowledges its improbability. So, what do you think? Was this built using lost engineering methods, or are we still missing a crucial piece of the story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tonnenar was not discovered in the dramatic, sudden way many ancient sites were. Instead, it emerged gradually from obscurity in the late 19th century, when explorers moving through the remote Ocosingo Valley in the highlands of Chiapas, southern Mexico, began documenting unusually massive stone terraces rising from the jungle floor. Early reports by researchers such as Desiree Charnay in the 1880s described a structure that did not resemble a conventional Maya city. What stood before them was not a spread of temples and plazas, but a single immense vertical formation. Later excavations throughout the 20th century, particularly those led by Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, revealed the full scale of the site. A towering acropolis rising over 70 meters in height, composed of at least 7 superimposed terraces, making it one of the tallest structures in the entire Maya world. From the moment its layout became clear, Tonnenar presented a problem that has never been fully resolved. Unlike major centers such as Tikal or Palenque, which expand horizontally across wide ceremonial plazas, Tonnenar compresses its entire ceremonial and political core into a vertically stacked system. This is not a minor variation. It represents a complete departure from the spatial logic of Maya urbanism. The most immediate mystery is therefore structural. Why would a civilization known for expansive layouts choose instead to construct what is effectively a vertical city? The engineering implications alone are significant. Building upward at this scale in a tropical environment introduces challenges that horizontal cities largely avoid. Each terrace must support the cumulative weight of all structures above it, requiring precise load distribution across stone retaining walls. Archaeological analysis shows that these walls are not crude accumulations of rubble, but carefully constructed systems of fitted limestone blocks, some weighing hundreds of kilograms. The stability of the Acropolis over more than a millennium suggests a sophisticated understanding of pressure management and foundational support. Compared to other Maya constructions, where even modest pyramids required periodic reinforcement, Tonenar's survival in a region with seasonal rainfall exceeding 2,000 millimeters per year is difficult to explain without assuming deliberate over-engineering. Even more striking is the issue of water control. In steep terraced environments, uncontrolled runoff typically leads to rapid erosion and structural collapse. Yet Tonenar incorporates subtle but effective drainage solutions, channels carved into stone, angled surfaces that direct water away from critical joints, and layered platforms that reduce hydraulic pressure. When compared with sites like Copan, where erosion has significantly damaged architectural features despite less extreme verticality, Tonenar appears disproportionately resilient. This raises a key question. Were its builders solving problems that did not yet exist, anticipating long-term environmental stress in a way that exceeds known Maya practices? The mystery deepens when examining how space is used within this vertical system. Movement through Tonenar is not free or open. It is guided, constrained, and often deliberately disorienting. Staircases are steep and narrow, forcing single-direction flow. Terraces limit visibility, preventing large-scale observation of ceremonies from a single vantage point. This contrasts sharply with the open plazas of sites like Chichén Itzá, where architecture is designed to accommodate large audiences and communal viewing. At Tonenar, spatial design appears to control not just movement but perception itself. This controlled environment becomes particularly significant when considering the site's massive ball court, one of the largest in Mesoamerica. Measuring over 100 meters in length, the court is embedded within the architectural framework rather than placed in an open civic space. Its elongated, enclosed design restricts both participation and observation, suggesting that the ballgame here may have functioned differently than at other Maya centers. While traditionally interpreted as a ritual tied to cosmology and myth, at Tonenar, it may have served as a form of controlled political performance, an event where outcomes and interpretations were tightly managed by elite authority. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Tonenar is renowned for its unusually explicit sculptural program, which emphasizes domination, captivity, and violence. Numerous monuments depict bound prisoners, decapitated figures, and victorious rulers standing over defeated enemies. These are not abstract representations of power. They are direct, almost confrontational statements. Inscriptions found at the site document repeated military conflicts, particularly with nearby Palenque, one of Tonenar's primary rivals during the Classic period. Epigraphic studies indicate that Tonenar may have captured and even executed high-ranking individuals from competing cities, reinforcing its political dominance through both action and imagery. What makes this significant is not merely the presence of violence, but its integration into the architecture itself. At Tonenar, power is not confined to monuments or inscriptions, it is embedded into the physical experience of the site. As one ascends the terraces, the combination of steep elevation, restricted movement, and constant visual reminders of conquest creates an environment that may have been designed to influence psychological response. In this sense, the Acropolis functions less like a ceremonial center and more like a controlled spatial narrative, guiding individuals through a sequence of experiences that reinforce authority. Yet even this interpretation leaves critical questions unanswered. If Tonninar was primarily a political instrument, why invest such extraordinary effort into vertical construction rather than more conventional displays of power? If it was defensive in nature, why does it lack many of the features typically associated with fortifications, such as perimeter walls or strategic lookout points? And if it was purely ceremonial, why does its engineering exceed the practical requirements of ritual use? Some researchers have proposed that Tonninar represents a localized architectural experiment, a deviation driven by regional conditions or specific cultural priorities. Others suggest that its design reflects a symbolic attempt to replicate sacred mountains, aligning the city with cosmological beliefs about the layered structure of the universe. However, these explanations remain partial. Neither fully accounts for the combination of advanced engineering, spatial control, and aggressive iconography that defines the site. In comparative terms, Tonninar occupies an unusual position within the Maya world. It is neither the largest nor the most artistically refined site, yet it demonstrates a level of structural ambition that rivals or exceeds more famous centers. Its verticality has few parallels, and its integration of architecture, engineering, and political messaging appears unusually cohesive. This combination suggests that Tonninar was not simply following established traditions, but actively redefining them. Ultimately, the greatest mystery of Tonninar may not lie in any single feature, but in the convergence of all its anomalies. It is a site where architectural form, environmental adaptation, and ideological expression intersect in ways that challenge existing models of Maya civilization. Despite decades of excavation and analysis, no single framework has been able to fully explain its design. Tonninar stands, therefore, as more than an archaeological site. It is a question in stone, one that forces us to reconsider what ancient cities were meant to be and whether some of them were built not just to function, but to shape how people think, move, and perceive power itself. In the fenlands of Lincolnshire in eastern England lies Crowland, a landscape that for centuries consisted of vast wetlands, marshes, peat bogs, and flood-prone lowlands. The ruins of Crowland Abbey dominate the area today, preserving evidence of one of medieval Britain's most remarkable engineering achievements. Historical records dating back to the 8th century describe the establishment of a religious settlement associated with St. Guthlac, while archaeological investigations conducted over the last 2 centuries have revealed foundations, water management features, masonry remains, and construction techniques that continue to puzzle researchers. The greatest mystery of Crowland begins with a simple question: why does the abbey still exist at all? Modern engineers understand the challenges of constructing large buildings on saturated ground. Soft soils compress under weight, foundations sink unevenly, and waterlogged terrain constantly shifts. Today, major projects built on unstable ground often require deep concrete piles, extending tens of meters below the surface. Yet the builders of Crowland Abbey created one of the most important monastic complexes in medieval England, in the middle of a marshland environment that should have made large-scale stone construction nearly impossible. The surviving remains indicate that the abbey was repeatedly expanded between the 11th and 15th centuries. Massive stone walls, towers, vaulted structures and supporting buildings required thousands of tons of material. Some sections of the complex rose more than 20 meters above the surrounding landscape. The problem is that the local geology was fundamentally hostile to such construction. Much of the Fenland region consists of peat deposits, silts, and waterlogged sediments that can behave almost like a sponge under heavy loads. Modern geotechnical studies show that peat-rich soils possess extremely low bearing capacity compared with bedrock. Large masonry structures built directly on such ground would normally experience severe settlement, yet Crowland survived. Archaeologists believe medieval builders may have used timber foundations, compacted gravel platforms, or carefully selected natural areas of firmer ground hidden beneath the marsh. However, no complete engineering record survives. Researchers can identify parts of the solution, but not the entire system. The situation resembles mysteries surrounding the construction of Venice, where builders drove millions of wooden piles into lagoon sediments, or the foundations of ancient Tenochtitlan in Mexico. In each case, civilizations developed specialized knowledge for building on waterlogged terrain. Crowland appears to represent a Northern European example of similar expertise. The difference is that much of Crowland's engineering knowledge vanished. Without water control, Crowland could not exist. The medieval fenlands covered thousands of square kilometers. Seasonal flooding constantly reshaped the landscape. Rivers changed course, drainage channels filled with sediment, and agricultural land could disappear beneath floodwaters. Yet Crowland became wealthy. Historical sources indicate that the abbey controlled extensive farmland, fisheries, waterways, and transportation routes. Such prosperity required sophisticated hydraulic management. The mystery lies in how accurately medieval engineers understood water behavior. Today, hydrologists rely on satellite imagery, topographic surveys, computer models, and flow simulations. Medieval builders possessed none of these tools. Nevertheless, they managed water successfully enough to support a major religious and economic center for centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests that drainage channels, embankments, and water control structures formed part of a coordinated system. Small differences in elevation, sometimes less than a meter across large distances, could determine whether land remained productive or flooded. Maintaining such systems required remarkable precision. Modern studies of reclaimed wetlands show that even minor errors in drainage gradients can drastically reduce effectiveness. Yet the medieval system functioned long before laser leveling, GPS surveying, or modern earth-moving equipment. Researchers know the system worked. What remains uncertain is exactly how its designers calculated gradients, managed seasonal fluctuations, and coordinated maintenance across a constantly changing landscape. Another puzzle concerns logistics. The abbey required enormous quantities of stone. Estimates for major medieval cathedrals and monasteries often reached tens of thousands of tons of building material. Crowland possessed no nearby mountain quarries. Stone had to be transported across difficult terrain dominated by wetlands and waterways. This raises a fascinating engineering question. How did medieval builders organize such large-scale transportation networks? Even today, transporting heavy materials through marsh environments presents challenges. Soft ground limits, wagon movement, seasonal flooding disrupts routes, and infrastructure must constantly be maintained. Researchers believe waterways probably played a crucial role. Boats and barges could move loads far more efficiently than land transport. Historical evidence from medieval England demonstrates that water transport often reduced transportation costs dramatically. However, many practical details remain unknown. How many vessels were involved? How were unloading operations conducted? How were construction schedules coordinated with seasonal river conditions? The surviving ruins demonstrate that the system worked, but the logistical mechanisms behind it remain largely invisible. In many ways, the challenge resembles the transport mysteries associated with Stonehenge, where massive stones travelled hundreds of kilometres, or the movement of granite blocks used in Egyptian pyramids. Crowland presents a medieval version of the same question. How did people without modern machinery move extraordinary quantities of material through an environment that actively resisted movement? Perhaps the most visually striking structure associated with Crowland is Trinity Bridge. Constructed around 1360, the bridge originally stood above the meeting point of multiple water channels. Unlike conventional bridges, it possesses 3 separate stairways converging at a central platform. Its unusual geometry continues to attract engineering interest. The structure effectively solved a complex transportation problem using a single stone monument instead of multiple bridges. The builders achieved this without modern structural analysis, finite element modeling, or computer calculations. Stone performs exceptionally well under compression, but poorly under tension. Medieval engineers had to design arches that distributed loads efficiently while minimizing structural weaknesses. The remarkable survival of Trinity Bridge suggests a sophisticated understanding of force distribution. Many historians compare such achievements to the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe, where master builders developed highly advanced structural solutions centuries before modern engineering theory formally described them. The bridge survives as evidence that practical engineering knowledge often preceded scientific explanation. Yet no detailed design documents survive to explain exactly how its builders calculated dimensions, load paths, or long-term durability. The masonry itself presents another mystery. Crowland Abbey contains examples of stonework that have endured weather, moisture, freeze-thaw cycles, and human conflict for centuries. Modern materials laboratories can analyze surviving mortar samples and stone composition. Researchers can identify minerals, estimate strengths, and reconstruct certain manufacturing processes. However, scientific analysis often reveals only part of the story. Construction quality depends not merely on materials but also on craftsmanship. The placement of stones, mortar preparation, curing conditions, foundation design, and structural sequencing all influence long-term durability. Many medieval master masons acquired knowledge through apprenticeship systems that transmitted techniques across generations. Unfortunately, most of that practical expertise was never written down. The phenomenon appears throughout history. Roman concrete survived for nearly 2,000 years before scientists began understanding some of the chemical processes responsible for its longevity. The mechanisms behind the Antikythera device disappeared entirely for centuries. Ancient dam builders, shipwrights, and architects often left structures but not explanations. Crowland belongs to the same category of lost engineering knowledge. Large engineering projects require strong management as well as technical skill. Medieval abbey construction involved hundreds of workers across many trades and often continued for generations. Crowland raises a key question. How did administrators coordinate such complex projects without modern communication tools? Despite the lack of phones, computers, or centralized records, construction continued and expanded for centuries. The systems that made this possible remain only partly understood. Rising 575 meters above sea level on a massive limestone mountain overlooking the Isthmus of Corinth in southern Greece, the stronghold dominated one of the most strategically important corridors in the ancient Mediterranean. For more than 2,000 years, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Franks, Venetians, and Ottomans all occupied the same summit. Yet the greatest mystery of Acrocorinth is not its military history. It is the extraordinary engineering hidden inside the mountain itself. Beneath the walls lies evidence of ancient hydraulic systems, underground chambers, water management technology, and logistical capabilities that remain only partially understood. Modern archaeologists can map the fortress using drones, laser scanning, and digital terrain models, but many of the technical decisions made by its builders continue to puzzle researchers. Acrocorinth, known today as Acrocorinth, stands above the ancient city of Corinth in Greece. The fortress occupies the summit of a steep limestone outcrop covering roughly 3 square kilometers. Ancient authors, including Strabo and Pausanias, described the site, ensuring that its location was never truly lost. However, systematic archaeological investigation accelerated during the 19th and 20th centuries through Greek, American, and international excavations. These studies revealed that the visible walls represent only a fraction of the much older and more complex engineering landscape extending beneath the surface. The greatest engineering mystery at Acrocorinth involves water. Throughout history, mountain fortresses shared one fundamental weakness: water supplies could be cut off during a siege. Many famous strongholds eventually surrendered not because their walls failed, but because their defenders ran out of water. Acrocorinth appears to have solved this problem. Archaeologists identified multiple cisterns, reservoirs, wells, and underground access routes connected to natural springs. The most famous is the Upper Perrine Spring, a water source carved deep into the limestone beneath the summit. Reaching the spring required descending through rock-cut stairways extending into the mountain. The engineering challenge is enormous. Limestone mountains contain highly complex underground drainage systems. Modern hydrogeologists often rely on geological surveys, drilling programs, and computer models to identify underground water pathways. Ancient builders possessed none of these tools, yet somehow they located reliable water sources with remarkable precision. Comparisons with other fortified sites reveal how unusual this achievement was. At the fortress of Masada in Israel, engineers built gigantic cistern systems to capture seasonal floods. At Acrocorinth, builders appear to have combined natural springs with artificial storage systems. This hybrid solution may have provided greater long-term reliability than many contemporary fortifications. Researchers still debate exactly how ancient engineers identified these underground water resources. Was the knowledge based on generations of geological observation? Did they recognize subtle surface indicators revealing hidden groundwater? The answer remains uncertain. Beneath the fortress lies another puzzle. Numerous tunnels, stairways, chambers, and rock-cut installations penetrate deep into the limestone. Some clearly served hydraulic purposes, while others remain difficult to explain. Several underground spaces occupy locations that offer little obvious military value. They're too isolated for routine storage and too inaccessible for large-scale habitation. Some researchers propose that parts of the system originated as sacred spaces associated with earlier religious activity. Others suggest emergency shelters, hidden supply routes, or components of an unfinished hydraulic network. The problem is that the fortress evolved continuously for over 2 millennia. Greek structures were modified by Romans, Roman structures were altered by Byzantine builders, and Byzantine installations were rebuilt by Crusaders, Venetians, and Ottomans. Each phase erased evidence from earlier phases. Laser mapping has revealed architectural inconsistencies, suggesting that some underground spaces may be significantly older than the visible fortress walls. Determining their original purpose remains one of the site's most difficult archaeological challenges. Every stone at Acrocorinth presents a logistical question. The fortress walls stretch for approximately 2 kilometers around the summit. Certain defensive sectors contain massive blocks weighing several tons. All construction materials had to be transported up steep mountain slopes before being shaped and installed. Modern engineers calculate construction logistics using load capacities, transportation models, and mechanical equipment. Ancient builders relied primarily on human labor, animals, ropes, wooden sledges, and simple lifting devices. The scale becomes clearer when compared with other mountain fortifications. transporting materials to Accra Corinth would have been significantly more difficult than building walls on level terrain such as those surrounding many Greek cities. Similar logistical challenges occurred at sites like Mycenae, Pergamon, and Masada, yet Accra Corinth's elevation made every stage of construction more demanding. Archaeologists still cannot fully reconstruct the transportation systems used during the earliest construction phases. No written manuals survive, and the engineering knowledge disappeared long ago. One of the most remarkable aspects of Accra Corinth is that its defences seem to emerge directly from the mountain itself. Rather than forcing the landscape to conform to architecture, builders integrated architecture into the existing geology. Cliffs became walls, narrow ridges became controlled access points, and natural bottlenecks evolved into defensive choke points. Modern military analysts often describe defensive depth as one of the most effective principles of fortification. Accra Corinth demonstrates this concept centuries before formal military engineering texts discussed it systematically. Attackers advancing toward the summit faced multiple defensive zones. Each gate forced movement into predictable directions. Elevated positions provided overlapping fields of observation. Defenders could concentrate force at critical locations while exploiting gravity itself as a weapon. Some historians compare the fortress to a gigantic natural war machine. The mystery is whether this sophistication emerged gradually through centuries of adaptation, or whether the earliest planners already understood the defensive potential of the mountain with surprising precision. Perhaps the most overlooked mystery concerns endurance. Historical records indicate that Accra Corinth repeatedly survived prolonged military threats. To achieve this, the fortress required food storage, water management, sanitation systems, maintenance facilities, and organizational planning. Scientists studying ancient siege conditions estimate that an adult requires at least several liters of water daily under warm Mediterranean conditions. A garrison numbering even a few thousand individuals would therefore consume enormous quantities of water every month. The cisterns preserved at Accra Corinth suggest large-scale planning, but researchers still debate the site's maximum sustainable population during wartime. This creates a fascinating engineering problem. How did ancient administrators calculate storage requirements? How much water could the reservoirs actually hold? How long could defenders survive complete isolation? Despite extensive research, no definitive answers exist. Ancient writers described a famous sanctuary dedicated to Aphrodite occupying the summit of Accra Corinth. The temple was among the most celebrated religious sites in ancient Greece, yet surprisingly little survives. Archaeologists recovered fragments, foundations, and scattered architectural remains, but the complete structure remains largely unknown. This absence creates a significant historical mystery. How could one of the most famous sanctuaries in the Greek world disappear so completely? Repeated rebuilding offers part of the explanation. Religious structures were transformed into churches, later converted into mosques, and repeatedly altered during successive occupations. Valuable stone blocks were reused in newer buildings, and earthquakes may have accelerated destruction. Nevertheless, researchers still cannot confidently reconstruct the temple's exact dimensions, architectural appearance, or engineering details. One of antiquity's most famous monuments survives primarily through texts rather than stone. On the edge of the lowest plateau in northern Shanxi, China, stands evidence of a civilization that seems almost impossible to explain. More than 4,000 years ago, an unknown people constructed the largest prehistoric stone city ever discovered in East Asia, crowned by a massive stepped pyramid that remained hidden from history until the late 20th century. For decades, local villagers believed the stone ruins scattered across the hills were sections of the Great Wall. It was not until systematic archaeological investigations beginning in the 1970s and large-scale excavations after 2011 that researchers realized they had uncovered something far older. Radiocarbon dating revealed that Shimao flourished between approximately 2300 and 1800 BCE, making it contemporary with the final centuries of Egypt's Old Kingdom and the rise of the Akkadian and Sumerian civilizations in Mesopotamia. What emerged from the excavations shocked archaeologists. Instead of a small regional settlement, Shimao proved to be a vast urban center covering roughly 400 hectares, protected by massive stone walls and dominated by a gigantic stepped pyramid unlike anything previously known from prehistoric China. Before the discovery of Shimao, archaeologists believed that the earliest large urban centers of Chinese civilization were concentrated mainly in the central plains along the Middle Yellow River. Shimao challenged that assumption entirely. The city stood on the northern frontier of ancient China, in a region previously considered peripheral to early state development. Yet the scale of the site rivals some of the most important urban centers of its era. The fortified area enclosed approximately 4 square kilometers. Multiple defensive walls stretch for kilometers across the landscape, and tens of thousands of people may have lived within and around the city. This raises an important question. Why did one of the largest cities in East Asia emerge in a region that historians once considered marginal? Some researchers argue that Shimao controlled important trade routes connecting agricultural communities in the south with pastoral societies of the northern steppe. Others suggest access to valuable resources such as jade may have transformed the city into an economic powerhouse. However, no explanation fully accounts for the enormous concentration of labor and wealth required to construct such a settlement. The mystery becomes even more striking when compared with contemporary societies. Around the same period, many settlements elsewhere in East Asia remain relatively small, while Shimao appears to have achieved levels of social organization far beyond what archaeologists once expected for the region. Another puzzle concerns the city's extraordinary stone architecture. Most prehistoric settlements in northern China relied heavily on rammed earth construction, and stone architecture on the scale observed at Shimao was virtually unprecedented. Archaeologists have documented extensive defensive walls constructed from carefully selected stone blocks. Some sections reach several meters in thickness and height, and the total volume of stone transported and assembled likely reached hundreds of thousands of tons. Modern engineers understand the difficulty of such projects. Quarrying stone is only the beginning. Workers must transport materials, shape blocks, stabilize foundations, and maintain structural integrity across uneven terrain. Yet no written records survive to explain how the builders organized these operations. The challenge becomes clearer when comparing Shimao with other ancient construction projects. The builders of Stonehenge transported stones weighing up to 25 tons, while Egyptian workers moved limestone blocks for the pyramids. At Shimao, an equally impressive logistical system appears to have operated, but the civilization responsible remains largely anonymous. The walls demonstrate sophisticated engineering knowledge, yet the knowledge itself has disappeared. One of the strangest discoveries at Shimao involved jade. Excavations revealed hundreds of jade artifacts deliberately embedded within sections of the city walls. In many ancient societies, jade represented prestige, wealth, and spiritual power, and such objects were normally placed in elite tombs or ceremonial contexts. At Shimao, however, valuable jade objects were literally sealed into construction materials. The purpose remains unknown. Some archaeologists interpret the practice as a ritual designed to protect the city. Others propose that jade symbolized political authority and legitimized the ruling elite. A third possibility is that the objects formed part of foundation ceremonies similar to rituals documented in later civilizations. What makes the mystery particularly important is the sheer scale of the practice. The builders sacrificed enormous quantities of valuable material for reasons that remain poorly understood. The decision suggests that engineering and religion may have been deeply intertwined within Shimao society. The greatest mystery of all rises from the center of the city. At the heart of Shimao stands a colossal stepped pyramid covering approximately 24 hectares. The structure rises about 70 meters above the surrounding landscape and consists of 11 distinct terraces stacked one above another, making it the largest known prehistoric stepped pyramid in China. The scale is astonishing. The base occupies an area comparable to dozens of modern football fields. Massive retaining walls support each terrace, while elite buildings, ceremonial spaces, and administrative complexes once occupied the upper levels. The structure transformed an entire mountain into a monumental architectural project. The engineering challenges are difficult to overstate. Building a stepped pyramid requires far more than stacking stones. Engineers must understand load distribution, slope stabilization, drainage control, and foundation reinforcement. Without these precautions, terraces collapse under their own weight. Modern geological studies indicate that the builders carefully integrated the natural topography into the design. Instead of constructing an artificial pyramid from scratch, they reshaped a hill and reinforced it using sophisticated retaining systems. This approach resembles techniques employed at certain Andean sites thousands of years later and also echoes principles observed in Mesopotamian ziggurats, where stepped platforms elevated political and religious authority above the surrounding city. Yet Shimao predates many comparable monumental projects in East Asia. Even more intriguing are the decorative elements discovered on the pyramid. Archaeologists uncovered carved stone reliefs depicting human faces, animals, and hybrid creatures. Some motifs resemble symbolic imagery that would later appear in Bronze Age Chinese cultures. This raises a profound question. Was Shimao an isolated civilization? Or was it the source of traditions that later influenced the development of Chinese civilization? The answer remains uncertain. Another mystery concerns construction logistics. Researchers estimate that moving and positioning the required stone would have demanded an enormous workforce operating over many years. The project required planning on a scale associated with early states and kingdoms, yet no written language has been discovered at the site. The builders achieved monumental engineering without leaving behind the historical records normally associated with such achievements. The city's defenses reveal another remarkable puzzle. Rather than relying on a single wall, Shimao employed multiple concentric defensive layers. Gates were positioned to restrict movement, narrow passageways created bottlenecks, and elevated observation points provided strategic visibility across the surrounding landscape. Many of these features resemble defensive concepts later used in medieval fortifications. The design suggests that warfare represented a significant concern. But who threatened such a powerful city? Archaeological evidence indicates periods of conflict, including discoveries of human skulls associated with ritual activity and possibly warfare. Yet the identity of Shimao's enemies remains unknown. The defensive system appears designed for a level of military organization rarely associated with prehistoric societies. Excavations near gateways uncovered one of the most disturbing discoveries ever made at the site. Researchers found evidence of large-scale human sacrifice, including numerous skulls believed to belong primarily to young women. Some estimates suggest that dozens of individuals may have been sacrificed during major construction phases. The practice recalls foundation sacrifices documented in various ancient civilizations. Similar rituals have been proposed for sites ranging from Mesopotamia to early dynastic China. However, the exact purpose remains uncertain. Were these offerings intended to protect the city? Were they demonstrations of political power? Or did they reflect religious beliefs that have vanished completely from history? The evidence provides clues but no definitive answers. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not how Shimao was built, but why it disappeared. Around 1800 BCE, the city was abandoned. Researchers suggest climate change, environmental stress, conflict, and political instability as possible causes, but no clear explanation exists. Despite its advanced stone construction, urban planning and engineering, the civilization vanished. History preserves the stones, but not the people who built them. Quilmes ruins, high in Argentina's Calchaquí valleys at nearly 2,000 meters above sea level, should never have supported a large population. Yet for centuries, thousands of people survived, farmed, and defended themselves in one of the harshest environments in the Andes. The stones remain, the engineering remains, but the knowledge behind it does not. Located in present-day Tucumán province, Argentina, the ruins were first documented by European observers in the 19th century and later investigated through systematic archaeological studies during the 20th century. Excavations revealed one of the largest pre-Columbian settlements in Argentina, covering more than 30 hectares across a mountainside overlooking the valley below. The first mystery begins with a simple question: where did the water come from? The Calchaquí valleys are semi-arid, with average annual rainfall often less than 300 millimeters, only a fraction of what many agricultural societies receive. Yet archaeological evidence indicates that Quilmes supported a population that may have reached several thousand inhabitants during its peak. Researchers have identified canals, reservoirs, drainage systems, and agricultural infrastructure distributed throughout the settlement. Water was captured from seasonal streams and redirected across difficult terrain to cultivated areas, meaning the challenge was not merely transporting water but controlling it. Modern hydraulic engineers understand that irrigation channels require carefully calculated gradients. If the slope is too steep, erosion destroys the channel. If it is too shallow, water stagnates before reaching its destination. The surviving remains suggest that Quilmes engineers successfully maintained this balance across an extensive network without metal surveying equipment or modern mathematical instruments. Comparable hydraulic achievements are known from Inca sites such as Machu Picchu, where sophisticated drainage systems continue to function after more than 5 centuries. Yet Quilmes remains far less studied, leaving many questions unanswered regarding the exact methods used to survey and construct its water infrastructure. The city appears to grow directly out of the mountain itself. Hundreds of structures, defensive walls, storage facilities, and terraces were constructed, using locally available stone. While the material was nearby, moving it across steep slopes presented a major engineering challenge. Unlike later colonial settlements, the builders of Quilmes had no wheeled transport systems suitable for construction. They also possessed no draft animals comparable to horses, oxen, or mules capable of hauling massive loads up mountain gradients. Archaeologists estimate that thousands of tons of stone were incorporated into the settlement over centuries of construction and expansion. The logistics involved would have required careful planning, coordinated labor, and knowledge of terrain management. This challenge resembles puzzles encountered elsewhere in the ancient world. The builders of Machu Picchu transported stone across mountain ridges, while the craters of Sacsayhuaman moved blocks weighing many tons. In every case, the structures survive while detailed records of construction techniques do not. The result is a familiar archaeological mystery, We can see what was built, but we cannot fully reconstruct how it was built. Quilmes was not merely a city, it was a defensive machine. The settlement occupied a strategic position on the mountainside, overlooking approaches through the valley. Multiple construction levels created natural defensive zones, meaning attackers advancing uphill would have been exposed to defenders positioned above them. The effectiveness of this design was demonstrated historically. The Quilmes people resisted both Inca expansion and later Spanish conquest, and historical records describe decades of resistance known as the Calchaquí Wars, among the longest indigenous resistance campaigns in South American history. What remains unclear is how the original planners selected specific defensive locations. Certain sectors provide exceptional visibility across the valley, while others appear optimized to funnel approaching forces into predictable routes. Modern military planners rely upon topographic maps, aerial imagery, and computer modeling to identify strategic positions. The engineers of Quilmes achieved remarkably similar results using only direct observation and accumulated experience. The sophistication of the defensive layout suggests a level of military engineering that remains difficult to quantify. Perhaps the greatest technological mystery of Quilmes is not its walls, its houses, or its defenses. It is agriculture. A city cannot survive without food, and water systems alone are useless unless they support agricultural production. The existence of Quilmes proves that its inhabitants solved one of the most difficult problems in ancient engineering. Producing reliable harvests in an environment where rainfall was scarce, soils were vulnerable to erosion, and temperature fluctuations could be severe. Across the mountainside, archaeologists have documented extensive agricultural terraces integrated directly into the landscape. These terraces transformed steep slopes into productive farmland, while simultaneously stabilizing soil and improving water retention. The engineering principles involved are extraordinary. Terracing reduces runoff velocity, allowing water to infiltrate soil rather than being lost downslope. It decreases erosion, conserves nutrients, and creates microclimates that can improve crop productivity. Modern agricultural science confirms the effectiveness of these techniques, and studies conducted in terraced farming regions worldwide have shown significant reductions in soil loss compared with unmodified slopes. Yet understanding why terraces work is easier than understanding how ancient builders designed them so effectively. The Quilmes engineers had no satellite imagery, no GIS software, no hydrological models, and no computerized terrain analysis. Nevertheless, they created agricultural systems capable of sustaining large populations in a semi-desert environment. Some researchers compare these achievements to the agricultural terraces of the Inca Empire, while others point to similarities with ancient terrace systems in the Mediterranean and parts of Asia. However, Quilmes developed under unique environmental conditions that required localized solutions. Several questions remain unresolved. How did the builders determine the optimal dimensions for each terrace? How did they calculate water distribution across hundreds of agricultural plots? How did they prevent catastrophic erosion during seasonal storms? How did they maintain soil fertility over generations? Evidence suggests that these systems functioned successfully for centuries. The long-term sustainability of the terraces may represent one of the most impressive examples of environmental engineering in pre-Columbian South America. Even today, researchers continue studying ancient agricultural systems to identify techniques that could help modern communities adapt to water scarcity and climate stress. In that sense, Quilmes may contain practical knowledge that remains relevant centuries after its abandonment. Producing food was only half the challenge. Inhabitants also needed to preserve it. Archaeologists have identified structures interpreted as storage facilities for agricultural products, and their placement within the settlement appears deliberate rather than random. The climate of the region creates significant temperature differences between day and night, conditions that can potentially aid preservation when storage facilities are designed correctly. Some researchers suggest that natural airflow patterns were exploited to improve ventilation and reduce spoilage. Similar passive storage principles appear in traditional systems across the Andes and Central Asia. If this interpretation is correct, the people of Quilmes possessed practical knowledge of environmental control centuries before modern refrigeration. The exact details of these storage techniques, however, remain poorly understood. The surrounding landscape offers commanding views across large sections of the valley. Several elevated points associated with the settlement may have functioned as observation stations. Archaeologists have proposed that smoke signals, fire beacons, or other visual communication methods connected Quilmes with neighbouring communities. Such systems are known elsewhere in history. The Roman Empire used beacon networks, and ancient China employed signal towers along frontier regions. Similar methods could have provided early warning against approaching enemies. Unfortunately, communication technologies often leave few archaeological traces. As a result, the existence of a regional signalling network remains plausible but difficult to prove conclusively. Perched more than 300 metres above sea level in the Euclidean range of northeast Wales, Moel y Gair overlooks the Vale of Clwyd and commands sweeping views across northern Wales. Archaeologists believe this ancient hill fort was occupied during the Iron Age, roughly between 800 BC and the Roman conquest of Britain. At first glance, it appears to be little more than a ring of ancient earthworks on a hilltop. Yet modern surveys, excavations, and landscape analysis reveal a far more intriguing story. Hidden within its banks and ditches are clues to engineering skills, environmental knowledge, and organizational abilities that remain only partially understood. More than 2,000 years after its construction, Moel y Gair continues to raise questions that modern archaeology cannot fully answer. The site was recognized as an ancient monument during 19th century surveys of the Clwydian hills, but systematic archaeological investigation developed gradually. Aerial photography, topographic mapping, geophysical surveys, and modern LiDAR scanning have since revealed details invisible from ground level. These technologies showed that Moel y Gair was not an isolated structure, but part of a larger network of hill forts spread across the Clwydian range. What researchers discovered was not merely a defensive enclosure, but evidence of a sophisticated understanding of terrain, construction, and regional communication. The first mystery begins with location. Modern military planners rely on satellite imagery, digital terrain models, and computer simulations to identify strategic positions. The builders of Moel y Gair possessed none of these technologies, yet they selected one of the most effective defensive locations in the region. From the summit, visibility extends across major natural routes running through northeast Wales, allowing anyone moving through the Vale of Clwyd to potentially be observed from the fort. Researchers studying visibility patterns have noted that the site occupies a position offering exceptional surveillance while remaining difficult to approach. This raises an obvious question. How did Iron Age builders determine the optimal location? The answer may seem simple: they climbed hills and looked around. However, choosing the best position among dozens of possible locations across a complex landscape is far more challenging than it appears. Modern viewshed analysis demonstrates that relatively small differences in elevation can dramatically affect visibility. The builder somehow identified a position that maximized observation while also providing access to water, grazing land, and transportation routes. Whether this resulted from generations of accumulated knowledge or deliberate large-scale surveying remains unknown. The second mystery involves the earthworks themselves. The defensive bank surrounding Moël Guerre may appear modest compared with stone fortifications such as those found in later Roman forts. Yet constructing them required an enormous amount of labour. Archaeological measurements indicate that thousands of cubic meters of earth and stone were moved to create the ramparts and ditches. Depending on the exact methods used, this could represent tens of thousands of individual labour hours. To appreciate the scale of this achievement, consider a comparison. A single cubic metre of compacted soil can weigh between 1.5 and 2 metric tons. Moving thousands of cubic metres without machinery would require a highly organised workforce. Every basket of soil had to be excavated, transported, and placed with precision. Every section of ditch required planning, and every rampart required stabilisation. Yet no written instructions survive. The builders left behind the finished structure but not the engineering knowledge that created it. The third mystery concerns structural durability. Moël Guerre has endured more than 2 millennia of wind, rain, frost, erosion and vegetation growth. Wales experiences some of the wettest conditions in Britain, and over centuries water gradually destroys poorly designed earthworks. Yet large portions of the fortification remain visible today. This survival suggests a sophisticated understanding of drainage and slope stability. Modern civil engineers use soil analysis, computer modelling, and geological surveys when designing large earthworks. Iron Age builders possessed none of these tools. Nevertheless, many sections of the ramparts continue to retain their form after approximately 2,000 years of exposure. How did they know which soils would remain stable? How did they manage water runoff? How did they prevent catastrophic collapse? Archaeologists can observe the results, but the practical techniques behind them remain largely speculative. The fourth mystery involves geology. Detailed surveys suggest that the builders exploited natural terrain with remarkable efficiency. Rather than imposing an artificial design onto the landscape, they integrated defensive structures into existing slopes and ridges. Steeper natural gradients were incorporated into the defensive system, reducing the amount of construction required. This approach resembles a principle used in modern military engineering: maximize natural advantages while minimizing labor costs. The problem is that such decisions require an accurate understanding of terrain. Today, engineers evaluate slope angles using instruments, whereas Iron Age builders relied entirely on observation and experience. The consistency with which hill forts across Britain exploit topography has led some researchers to argue that a sophisticated body of practical landscape knowledge once existed. If so, that knowledge disappeared long ago. The fifth mystery concerns communication. Moël Guerre was not alone. Several other hill forts occupy prominent positions along the Cloydian range, and many are visible from one another, creating the possibility of an interconnected observation network. This raises fascinating questions. Could signals have been transmitted between hill forts? Could warning messages have travelled across large distances using fire or smoke? Could communities have coordinated responses to threats through visual communication? Comparable systems existed elsewhere in the ancient world. Classical Greek states used beacon chains. Roman military forces employed signalling stations, and medieval kingdoms later developed similar warning networks. The challenge is that almost no direct evidence survives for how communication functioned in Iron Age Wales. The geography suggests the possibility, but the archaeology remains inconclusive. The sixth mystery concerns life inside the enclosure. Geophysical surveys indicate that Moël Guerre was more than a refuge used only during emergencies. Evidence suggests repeated occupation and organised activity within the fort. The arrangement of internal spaces appears structured rather than random. This raises an important question. who designed the settlement. Planning a hilltop community requires decisions about housing, storage, movement, defense, and resource management. These considerations resemble challenges faced by urban planners today, albeit on a smaller scale. The existence of organized layouts suggests that at least some individuals possessed specialized knowledge about settlement design. Yet their identities, methods, and training remain unknown. The seventh mystery involves labor organization. Archaeologists often focus on structures, but every structure represents human coordination. To build Moëlli Guerre, workers had to gather materials, transport resources, prepare foundations, construct defenses, and maintain the site. Food had to be supplied, tasks had to be assigned, and work had to be coordinated. Modern project management relies on written plans and records, whereas Iron Age societies relied entirely on memory and oral communication. This raises one of the most difficult questions in archaeology. How are large construction projects organized in societies that left few written documents? The answer remains elusive. The eighth mystery is the relationship between Moëlli Guerre and broader developments in Iron Age Britain. Across Britain, hill forts emerged during a period of significant social change. Some became political centres, others functioned as economic hubs, and a few developed into major population centres. Moëlli Guerre belongs to this wider phenomenon, yet its exact role remains debated. Was it primarily a fortress, a ceremonial centre, a symbol of authority, a refuge during conflict, or perhaps all of these simultaneously? Different interpretations produced very different pictures of the society that built it.